Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. Alright, so, camping. Not my thing. Never was. See, I grew up out west. We're flat. Doesn't even begin to describe it. We're talking pancake level flat. Locals called these little bumps in the ground mountains. Bless their hearts. But they were nothing compared to these legit monsters that surround this town. Back home, the horizon just went on forever. No big deal. Hiking. That was a stroll through the park, paved paths, trees in neat little rows. The whole idea of sleeping in the woods, pitch black, nothing but nature and creepy crawlies. Yeah, no thanks. About as appealing as those mountains back home. My mom, though, she always wanted more. She was never really cut out for the whole small town, endless plains vibe. Always dreamed of something bigger, better. She never really knew what that better was, but she knew it wasn't there. So, when she landed this new job here, in this mountain town, she saw it as our golden ticket. Fresh start and all that jazz. I was heading off to college anyway, so perfect timing, right? We packed up our lives, said goodbye to the big, open sky, and traded it in for the shadow of these actual mountains. But even with the change of scenery, I never really fit in here. I mean, the mountains are pretty, sure, in a postcard kind of way. But they're also kind of looming. Suffocating, even. They just stand there, all silent and judgy, like they're constantly reminding me that I'm an outsider. Not from around here. I always figured I'd bounce as soon as I graduated. Maybe head back west to the flatness, or try my luck in some huge city where nobody knew my name. You know, new identity type of thing. But here I am, still stuck. Those mountains that were supposed to be a temporary backdrop, they're starting to feel more permanent than my high school haircut. My college buddies were a different breed. Take Ethan, for example. He grew up in a town not too far from here. One of those guys who's just at ease in the woods. Weekends camping. No problem. All-day hikes. Sign him up. Ethan had stories about hunting with his dad, fishing in streams so cold your teeth ached, and camping in forests so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. He was always itching for the next adventure, always trying to get back to the wild. Then there was Liam. He was more the cautious type when it came to the outdoors. Grew up around here too, but he had a healthy respect for, not dying out there. A planner, that one. Everything had to be mapped out, triple-checked. Which of course drove Ethan crazy. Liam's girlfriend, Chloe, was usually along for the ride. She loved being outside as much as Liam, but she was way more chill about it. Go with the flow, that was Chloe. She was the glue that held those two together, that's for sure. And then you had Noah. Quiet guy, more into his own head than the rest of us. Not exactly a woodsman, but he appreciated nature, He was all about his camera, capturing the perfect shot, finding beauty in the little things. Me and him, we got each other, so when Ethan floated the idea of a camping trip, a little escape from the city, I was like, hard pass. Roughing it in the woods. Not my style. But then I thought, why the hell not? It actually sounded fun, and I definitely needed a break. The city was sucking the life out of me, and my job was so mind-numbingly boring I could feel my brain cells dying. Figured some fresh air, a little peace and quiet, might do me some good. Maybe even help me figure out what the heck I was doing with my life. Ethan, naturally, took charge of the whole thing. Borrowed his uncle's SUV. Said his uncle barely used it anymore, bad knees and all, and it was just gathering dust. Thing was a beast, perfect for these rough mountain roads, and had tons of space for all our gear. His uncle seemed cool though. Real outdoorsy type. Spent his whole life in these mountains. He even gave us some tips about these hidden spots, These killer views that weren't on any map. I guess we all had our own reasons for wanting to go. Ethan was chasing adventure. Liam and Chloe were all about that nature connection. And Noah was probably already planning his Instagram posts. Me, I just wanted to unplug. Maybe find some clarity or something in the silence of the woods. As we were loading up this UV, though I realized none of us were really paying attention to the old man's advice. We were too hyped about the trip, about escaping our lives for a bit. But as I was tossing my bag in, Ethan's uncle gave me this look. It was weird. He handed me this crumpled up flyer, all emergency numbers and walkie-talkie frequencies. My nephew. He doesn't always take this stuff seriously, he said, his voice all gravelly. But you seem like the type who might. I just mumbled a thanks. Not really sure why he singled me out. Maybe because I was the quiet one, the one who clearly didn't belong in the woods. The drive took, 2 hours. The road just kept winding up and up, the trees getting thicker, the city shrinking in the rearview mirror. The mountains unfolded into this valley, and it was something. A long way to go for something that looked so close from my office window. With every mile, I felt like I was putting more distance between my old life and whatever this was going to be. The others were laughing, telling stories from when they were kids. All these camping memories I definitely didn't have. They hadn't done this stuff in years, but you could tell they had a connection to it. Me, I was totally out of my element. I just sat in the back, lost in my own head, flipping through the pamphlets Ethan's uncle gave me. One was called Search and Rescue in the Woods, which was, super reassuring. I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake this feeling that was starting to creep up on me. Nervousness, maybe. So, there we were, a bunch of recent grads with backpacks that probably weighed more than we did. We had these brochures from the campground owners shoved in our pockets, along with the essentials. Survival gear, enough food to feed a small army, water, and all the other stuff you need when you're playing Mountain Man. A little adventure, right? I felt kind of ridiculous, like I was romanticizing the whole thing. But what do you expect from a guy who hasn't seen this much nature since? Well, ever. Out here, it's not like there's a Starbucks every 2 blocks or any blocks at all. But as we got deeper into the woods, I started to loosen up. The others were goofing off, laughing, and their vibe was kind of infectious. We got to the trailhead later than we planned, so we decided to crash at the campground that night and start our hike to the cabin first thing in the morning. Waking up the next day was different. The air was so clean it almost hurt. I hadn't realized how used to the city stink I was. That constant smell of fast food and exhaust fumes. But out here, it was like taking a deep breath after being underwater for way too long. It's the little things, The tiny details you don't even notice until they're gone. Like those lazy summer days as a kid that seemed so boring at the time, but you'd kill to have back now. We scarfed down some breakfast, packed up our gear, ditched the car, and hit the trail. As the sun started to set, we were deep in the woods, miles from anywhere. And the sounds, it was like nothing I'd ever heard. The city was always buzzing, and the plains were just quiet. But this was a whole symphony of rustling leaves, buzzing insects, owls hooting, and who knows what else making noises in the dark. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting some wild animal to come strolling out of the trees. We finally made it to the cabin. It was this little, beat-up shack tucked away in the trees, but it looked cozy, Clearly, other people had used it before. It was like a little haven in the middle of nowhere, a place to get warm and out of the elements. We dropped our packs, stretched our aching muscles, and just took it all in. Nighttime came quick, so we built a fire outside. It was small, but it felt huge, pushing back the darkness. And man, was it dark. But in a good way, Peaceful. We sat around the fire, the flames dancing in our eyes, just talking and laughing. It felt good. Just being there with my friends, no distractions. Ethan, being Ethan, was telling these crazy stories about his childhood camping trips, probably making up half of it, but we were all cracking up anyway. Liam and Chloe were doing their usual playful bickering thing, which was always entertaining. Noah was snapping pictures of the fire, probably already editing them in his head. And me, I was actually relaxing. The city, my job, all that crap just melted away. The fire crackled, we roasted marshmallows, told stupid jokes. The conversation flowed easy, the laughter got louder. It was simple, pure. Just friends hanging out under the stars, miles away from the real world and all its problems. As the fire died down to embers, the talking slowed down too. The stars were insane, like diamonds scattered across the sky, and the air was filled with the sounds of the forest, like nature's lullaby. The cabin, the forest, the mountains. It all felt so alive, so full of something. For the first time in a long time, I felt content, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Eventually we put out the fire and headed inside. It was the perfect night, the kind you remember forever. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt this wave of calm wash over me, like everything was going to be okay. The cabin, the forest, the mountains, they weren't just scenery anymore. They were becoming a part of me. The next morning was postcard perfect. Blue sky, sun shining, the whole valley spread out below us like a painting. We stepped out of the cabin, and the view just smacked me in the face. The mist was still clearing out, revealing all these greens and browns, like the forest was waking up. And the air, crisp, clean, like a slap in the face compared to the city smog I was used to. It was one of those mornings that made you feel glad to be alive, like you could do anything. Inside the cabin, we found a few more brochures lying around, probably left by rangers or other hikers. The usual stuff: maps, safety tips, ads for local attractions. As I was flipping through them, my eyes landed on the fridge. There was this kid's drawing stuck to it with magnets. It was one of those messy crayon drawings, done in a hurry, but you could tell a kid put their heart into it. It showed a family, mom, dad, little girl, holding hands in front of what looked like a forest. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another cheesy family drawing. But then I looked closer, and something felt off. It was the faces. They were all frowning, like really exaggerated sad faces. The kind of sad only a kid can draw, where the emotions are just so raw. And then I saw it, in the background, tucked away in the bushes, drawn in thick black crayon. A figure. A man, maybe. But he didn't have a face. Just a blank space where his features should have been. It gave me the creeps. I tried to joke about it in my head like, well, at least he's not sad. But the image stuck with me. We packed up and left the cabin, ready to explore the valley. The trails were easy to follow, winding through the trees, taking us further and further away from civilization. It felt like we were stepping back in time. We bumped into a park ranger coming the other way. Older guy, weathered face, uniform looked like he'd been wearing it for decades. He stopped us, held up a hand, and gave us this friendly but firm warning. Animals have been acting strange lately, he said. Best to stick to the designated paths and follow the rules. As long as you do that, you won't have anything to worry about. His words were probably meant to be reassuring, but they just left me feeling uneasy. Was that supposed to be a joke? I didn't know what to make of it, and his serious expression didn't give anything away. I get it. It's his job to warn people, to tell them to stay on the trails. But the way he said it, the way he just left it hanging there, it was weird. I spent the next hour or so thinking about it, the ranger's warning putting a damper on my mood. But the scenery was just too amazing to ignore. Fresh air, stunning views. I was actually surprised how well I was handling the hike. Maybe those new hiking boots were worth the money after all. It took us longer than we thought to reach our next stop, and when we finally got there, something felt wrong. The sign at the rest area didn't match the name on our map. Candle Crest. That wasn't on the map. I pointed it out to the others, but they just shrugged. We were tired, and the place looked good enough, so we decided to camp there anyway. Right spot or not, the trip had been going great. I was finally starting to unwind, to disconnect from the daily grind. It felt like we had stepped into another world, far away from the reality I had left behind. I sat down for a minute, just to jot down some thoughts, trying to clear my head, to sort through all the junk that had been piling up. This morning was a little rougher than the others. I was dragging, struggling to keep up while packing up my tent. My hands felt clumsy, like I was moving through molasses. My head was fuzzy, too, like I'd just woken up from a super weird dream. I could only remember bits and pieces. A pale moon hanging low in the sky. And this feeling of walking forever under a canopy of trees that felt wrong, somehow. The dream left me with this uneasy feeling that I couldn't shake, even after I was fully awake. After a quick breakfast, we hit the trail again. As we got deeper into the valley, it got colder. Noticeably colder. The thick forest started to thin out, giving way to these rolling hills and rocky patches. The mountains that had been way off in the distance were now right on top of us, their peaks hidden by this thick mist. It felt like we'd stumbled into some hidden world, forgotten by time, untouched by anything modern. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle in the leaves or a bird call way off in the distance. Even those sounds seemed muffled, swallowed up by the heavy air. I tried to get my bearings, but nothing looked right. The further we went, the more confused I got. The landmarks we'd been following were gone, replaced by I don't even know. When I checked the compass and tried to backtrack in my head, I realized with a jolt that we should have reached our campsite by now. Like, it should have been right here. But there was nothing. No sign, no clearing, just more trees and rocks. Did we take a wrong turn? When? I voiced my concerns to the others, but they brushed me off. They were more interested in setting up camp than dealing with my growing anxiety. They were fine just pitching their tents here, near the edge of the trees. It was quiet here. Too quiet. The silence pressed in on us as we started to set up camp, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Everything took longer than it should have, like even the air was fighting us. We weren't used to setting everything up from scratch, no pre-made campsite to make things easy, but we managed. It wasn't pretty, but it would do. By the time we were done, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, leaving us in this weird, fading light. As the last bit of daylight faded, the shadows got long and creepy, and the cold started to really seep in. I was freezing, even with all my layers on. The others were tired, too, their earlier excitement gone, replaced by this heavy exhaustion. We barely talked, just a few grunts and murmurs. The silence broken only by the crackling of the fire we managed to get going. The flames were weak, casting these weird, dancing shadows on the trees, which now looked like giant, watchful figures. The darkness that settled in was like nothing I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just dark. It was thick, heavy, like a physical presence pressing down on us. Every now and then, a twig would snap, or the wind would whisper through the trees, and I'd tense up, waiting for something to jump out at us. But nothing came. Just that heavy, unsettling silence. As I crawled into my tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That something was out there in the dark, watching us. Waiting. The thought stuck with me, making it hard to breathe. I just lay there, staring up at the tent fabric. Every little sound amplified by my racing thoughts. The rustling leaves, the creaking branches, even my friend's breathing. It all seemed to blend together into this creepy rhythm. And as I lay there, half awake, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd gone too far. If we'd crossed some invisible line and ended up somewhere we weren't supposed to be. The next morning, one of the tents was gone. Sarah was gone. Her tent, her stuff, everything, vanished. And the weirdest part, I couldn't even remember where her tent had been the night before. I was too out of it, too distracted by the whole situation and that nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Ethan tried to take control, tried to keep everyone calm. He said Sarah must have had her reasons for taking off. His voice was steady, but I could see him biting the inside of his cheek, a nervous habit he had. He was trying to convince himself as much as the rest of us. Ethan was usually the guy cracking jokes, keeping things light, but now his confidence seemed forced, like he was trying too hard to be the leader. Liam and Chloe, who were closest to Sarah, were freaked out. They were the ones most affected by her disappearance, their worry bordering on panic. Liam's voice, usually so calm, got louder and sharper as he started questioning Ethan, frustration bubbling up. Chloe, normally the peacemaker, was unusually quiet, her eyes darting around the campsite like she expected Sarah to just pop out of the trees. Their reactions were raw, real, totally different from Ethan's forced calm. Noah was glued to his phone, desperately trying to get a signal to call for help. But we were too deep in the wilderness. No bars. When Ethan handed him the walkie-talkie, Noah's frustration just exploded when he realized the batteries were dead. The freaking batteries. It was such a small thing, but in that moment, it felt like the last straw. Noah wasn't one to lose his cool, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tightened around the useless walkie-talkie. We wasted so much time arguing, throwing out wild theories. Tempers flared, and the blame game started. Why didn't anyone see Sarah leave? Why didn't we have someone on watch? Why weren't the batteries checked? The argument went on and on, everyone pointing fingers, trying to figure out who screwed up. I stayed out of it mostly. I didn't want to get dragged into the drama. But they kept pulling me in, asking my opinion, demanding I take a side. I didn't know Sarah as well as the others, and I definitely wasn't eager to jump into that mess. It was almost noon by the time we finally decided to split up and look for Sarah. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. I ended up with Ethan, while Liam and Chloe stuck together, still arguing, their fear getting the better of them. Noah, the most level-headed of us, volunteered to stay at the camp in case Sarah came back on her own. It made sense, but there was also this unspoken hope that maybe, just maybe, Sarah would just stroll back into camp like nothing happened. Ethan tried to lighten the mood as we set off, cracking a few jokes that fell flat. His usual easygoing attitude was strained, the latter forced. It was obvious he was just using humor to cover up his own anxiety. I could see the worry etched on his face, betraying the confidence he was trying so hard to project. Despite his attempts to keep things light, I knew he was just as scared as the rest of us. As we pushed through the undergrowth, calling Sarah's name, the weight of the situation pressed down on me. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt different. Menacing. The silence was heavy, the usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, birds, seemed muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The only sounds were our footsteps and our calls, which only reminded me how isolated we were. At one point, Ethan stopped, his brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the wind and the faint sound of a stream. "Hear what?" I whispered back, my heart pounding. He shook his head, looking troubled. "I don't know. I thought I heard something. Probably just my imagination." We kept going, but the tension just kept building. It felt like we were walking into something we shouldn't be, a place that felt more and more wrong with every step. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I started to wonder if splitting up was such a good idea after all. As the light started to fade, Ethan and I exchanged a look. We both knew it. We weren't finding Sarah. No footprints, no signs, nothing. It was like she'd just evaporated. Whatever I had expected to happen on this trip, it sure as hell wasn't this. I came out here looking for a change, a break from the monotony. But sometimes change comes in ways you can't predict. And in moments like this, All I wanted was to go back to the familiar, to the comfort of the world I'd taken for granted. Ethan and I headed back to camp, our pace quickening as we saw Noah frantically waving us over. Seeing him should have been a relief, but something felt off. As we got closer, we saw her, Sarah. She was back at camp. But something was wrong. Her gear, which she had taken with her, was gone. Her jacket, which used to fit her perfectly, now hung loose on her shoulders, like she had lost a ton of weight in just a few hours. She was just standing there, facing away from us. I couldn't explain it, but something about the way she was standing made my stomach clench. We hurried closer, trying to hide our unease as we called out to her, asking what happened, why she left with her stuff, why she was just standing there like a statue. But Noah didn't answer our questions. His expression just got darker, his unease turning into something close to dread. It was like he couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew, like the person standing in front of us wasn't Sarah at all. Ethan, trying to bring some sense of normalcy back, stepped forward. He called out to Sarah again, his voice tight with frustration and concern, demanding to know what the hell was going on. He reached out, put a hand on her shoulder, like he was going to turn her around and finally get some answers. But when she turned, it was like the world tilted on its axis. Her face, if you could even call it that, was wrong. It was like someone had stretched her features over her skull, pulling them into an expression that wasn't quite right. Her eyes were too wide, her smile too big, like she was trying to mimic a human expression, but didn't quite get it. My stomach churned as the thing that looked like Sarah opened its mouth, and the voice that came out was hollow, a flat echo of Sarah's voice. "Come with me. I have something to show you," it said, the words chillingly empty. Its arms reached out towards Ethan, repeating the same sentence. "Come with me. I have something to show you." As it took a step closer, that awful smile never leaving its face. Ethan froze, his hand sliding off the creature's shoulder as he took a step back. But before he could react, the creature's face contorted again, this time making a different sound, a voice filled with panic, fear, and desperation. It was Sarah's voice, but it was real this time, or at least it sounded real. "Oh my God, please, please no. Go away, please, oh my God, please no," the creature wailed. But the face stayed locked in that twisted, mocking grin. The contrast was unbearable, like a cruel parody of Sarah's final moments. Ethan, usually so composed, looked like he was about to lose it right there. Then, faster than I could blink, the creature's arm shot out, its fingers wrapping around Ethan's wrist with impossible strength. There was a moment of stunned silence before I heard it. Sickening crack as the creature snapped the bone in his arm like a twig. Ethan's scream ripped through the air, a sound so raw and full of pain that it jolted me out of my frozen state. But before I could do anything, Noah, thank God for Noah, sprang into action. I saw him out of the corner of my eye, grabbing the walkie-talkie we thought was useless, and he charged at the creature, swinging it with all his might. The first blow landed hard, and for a second, I thought it was over. The creature stumbled, letting go of Ethan, who crumpled to the ground, clutching his broken arm. But the creature didn't run. Instead, it slowly turned its head towards Noah, that horrible grin never faltering, its eyes locking onto him with terrifying intensity. Noah didn't back down. He kept swinging, hitting the creature again and again, each blow more desperate than the last. But the creature barely flinched. It was like hitting a brick wall. Then, in a blur of motion, the creature lunged at Noah, its limbs moving with a speed and fluidity that shouldn't have been possible. They were locked together, Noah struggling against the thing with all his might, but it was clear he was outmatched. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, as the creature twisted and turned, using its inhuman strength to overpower Noah. I could see the terror in his eyes, the dawning realization that this was it. And then it happened. A swift, brutal motion as the creature twisted his neck with a force that no human could muster. The sound of nose-neck snapping was like a gunshot echoing through the trees, followed by the sickening thud of his lifeless body hitting the ground. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but all I could do was watch in horror as the creature dragged Noah's body into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. The shadows swallowed them whole, leaving Ethan and me alone in the clearing, too shocked, too terrified to even move. We just stood there, staring after them, as the full weight of what just happened crashed down on us like a tidal wave. Half an hour later, Liam and Chloe came back from their search, their faces streaked with tears. The moment they walked into the clearing, I could tell they were shattered by something they had seen. But in their grief, they didn't immediately notice that Noah was missing too. What followed was a chaotic, disjointed mess of words as they tried to explain what they found. I wanted to tell them everything, to spill out the horror that was still churning inside me. But then I saw Ethan out of the corner of my eye. He was shaking his head, a silent plea for me to stay quiet. There was a desperate, almost wild look in his eyes that said it all. No one would believe us, not unless they had seen it with their own eyes. Ethan, ever the quick thinker, started spinning a story. He told them that a wild animal, probably a rabid dog, attacked the camp, and that Noah had chased it into the woods to scare it off. I could tell that Liam and Chloe were skeptical. Their eyes darted between us, searching for something that made sense. But they were too distraught, too overwhelmed by their own discovery to press the issue. Through choked sobs, they told us what they found: Sarah's body, lying broken at the base of a cliff. Her face had been completely smashed in the fall, making it impossible to recognize her. They had only identified her by the tattoos on her arms. Tattoos they knew all too well. Her clothes were gone, stripped away, and there was no sign of her gear. They started to speculate wildly, trying to piece together a narrative that could make sense of it all. Maybe she fell, maybe she was attacked, maybe she tried to run and didn't make it. But their theories were just grasping at straws, their minds refusing to accept the impossible. As they talked, I just sat there, feeling myself slipping into this numb state. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, the nightmarish events replaying over and over in my head. It was like my brain was trying to protect me from the full weight of what I'd seen, but it was a losing battle. The memory of that unnerving smile, the sound of bones snapping, and Noah's lifeless body being dragged into the woods were seared into my mind. Someone, maybe it was Chloe, suggested firing a flare to signal for help. I don't know why we hadn't thought of it sooner, but it was like my brain was running on fumes, incapable of processing even the simplest solutions. Ethan, with his good arm, pulled a flare gun from one of the packs and fired it into the sky. The bright, burning light arced into the air, casting an eerie glow over the treetops before it fizzled out, swallowed by the darkness. The flare seemed to hang there for a moment, a tiny spark of hope in the oppressive silence, before it vanished, leaving us in a world that suddenly felt even darker, even more isolated than before. The rest of the events blurred together in my memory. The deafening roar of a helicopter cutting through the stillness, the sudden rush of wind as it descended, the search and rescue teams flooding the campsite, asking questions we couldn't answer. We were airlifted out of that cursed place, taken far away from the horrors that had unfolded there. But the terror remained, lodged deep within me, a constant reminder of the nightmare that had become our reality. It's been 6 months since that day, and in all that time, none of us have spoken a word about it. After the initial chaos of our return, when everyone was asking questions and the police were involved, everything just stopped. The others, Liam, Chloe, Ethan, they're like ghosts to me now. People I used to know, but can't reach anymore. We all went to Sarah's funeral, but that was the last time I saw them. We stood there, numbly watching as her casket was lowered into the ground, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. None of us had the courage to speak about what really happened, about the horror we had witnessed. And Noah is still listed as missing. His family is holding on to hope, even though Ethan and I know the truth. But neither of us had the guts to tell them, to look them in the eyes and explain that their son, their brother, isn't just missing. He's gone in a way that no one should ever have to understand. I thought I could move on, bury it deep inside, and go back to the life I had before. I even convinced myself that maybe it was all just some terrible nightmare, that my mind had twisted reality into something far darker than it really was. But deep down, I know the truth. I know that what we saw out there, what happened to Sarah and Noah, wasn't something you could explain away with logic or reason. It was something far worse, something that had been waiting for us in those woods, waiting for the right moment to strike. I can't keep this bottled up anymore. It's eating me alive. The fear, the guilt. I have to tell someone, anyone, before it consumes me completely. That's why I'm writing this all down, trying to put into words the nightmare that's been haunting me for months. Maybe if I can get it out, if I can finally share what happened, I can start to move on. Maybe I can convince myself that it wasn't real, that it was all just some horrible hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. But something happened today that shattered that fragile hope. Something that made it impossible for me to deny the truth any longer. This morning, I was sitting in my usual spot at the coffee shop, sipping my latte, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that I could go back to normal. But then I saw him. No. Or something that looked like Noah. He was sitting a few tables away, casually flipping through a magazine, like nothing had happened. But his face was wrong. It was distorted, stretched, like someone had taken his features and pulled them over something else. Everything was slightly off. His eyes were too far apart, his mouth too wide, and his nose was just a little too crooked. It was like looking at a bad of the guy I used to know. And then he smiled at me. It wasn't a normal smile. It was that same awful, twisted grin that stretched his face even further, pulling the skin taut until it looked like it might split. My stomach churned, and a cold wave of terror washed over me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on that grotesque smile. No one else seemed to notice. The barista called out orders, people chatted on their phones, and the world went on like nothing was wrong. But I knew that thing sitting there wasn't not really. I bolted out of the coffee shop, leaving my drink behind, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was back at my apartment, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the keys. Now, I'm sitting at my desk, staring at the clock, but my mind is far away, back in those mountains. My eyes drift to the window, to the distant peaks that loom on the horizon, and all I can do is pray. Pray that whatever is out there stays where it is, that it doesn't follow me here, that it doesn't spill over into this world. But deep down, I know it's too late. Officially, it was called Harrison's Cave, but nobody in town actually used that name. Nope, we all just called it the Labyrinth. It was our main tourist trap, and a pretty weird one at that. See, the entrance and the exit were right next to each other, separated by just a 4-foot limestone wall. But to get from one to the other, you had to go through over a mile of twisty, maze-like tunnels. Most paths were dead ends, but there was one, and only one, perfect route that would lead you out. Back in the 70s, they put up some signs to give you hints, but the real challenge was to make it through without using those or one of the maps they handed out at the trailhead. Because even for folks who'd done it a dozen times, it could get seriously disorienting in there. Dim lighting got installed in the 380s, which helped a bit. I mean, it wasn't much, but it was way better than the pitch black of an unlit underground pit. No matter what they did to make it easier, though, there was just a certain vibe inside. A lot of people found it hard to remember why they even went in, let alone the crazy sequence of turns to get out. Despite the maps and signs, park rangers still had to go in at least once a week to drag someone out who'd gotten hopelessly lost. But some of them claimed they got lost in a different way than just taking a few wrong turns. Some swore they'd been following a voice, one that offered to show them the way, one that was always just in the next room. Local stories always stressed, never go into the maze alone. Back in the early 90s, they only had staff on site during the day, and they used this janky paper system to track who was in the cave. You had to sign in and out by hand, and for bigger groups, they usually just had one person sign in and say how many were with them. Sounds crazy by today's standards, right? But it worked okay for years. The rangers were even confident enough that they'd turn off the lights inside after closing to save energy and minimize the impact on the cave's ecosystem. But their system had one serious flaw. It relied on people being honest. Campfire stories told of at least 3 cavers before my time who went into the labyrinth and never came out. And I was 4 years old in 1995 when it claimed a 4th. There was this one tunnel in the deepest part of the main maze that was closed to the public, locked behind a gate. Only park staff could go in there, though nobody had in nearly 10 years by that summer. Not since victim number 3 was rumored to have vanished in those tunnels. Stories varied about why it was blocked off in the first place. Some said it was full of toxic gas pockets. Others swore it was because of sheer drops into bottomless pits, and a few claimed the forbidden caverns were home to some kind of freaky, violent cryptids. But if you asked someone who'd actually been through the gate, they'd just say the area didn't feel right. The lights didn't reach in there. And they said it always felt like something was watching them from the darkness. Something they were never quite fast enough to catch with their headlamps. And there was no reliable map to follow. Sure, people had tried to chart it, but they'd swear it was impossible because it changes. This was the area that made people scared to explore the cave alone. Whatever was in there, the stories of the missing cavers had 2 things in common. All 3 had been exploring beyond the gate, and all 3 had been alone when they disappeared. Their bodies were never found, so no one could be sure they'd actually died in there. But when 12-year-old Ethan Miller lost his life, people started to think they'd met the same fate. Ethan wasn't exactly Mr. Popular. He was more into books than sports or, being social. A classic teacher's pet who had the bad luck of being in grade school in the early 90s when being a nerd made you an instant target. And like a lot of W90s nerds, he ended up on the wrong end of a prank gone horribly wrong. When the cool kids in his class invited Ethan to hang out, he reportedly told his mom he was super excited to finally have friends. His only feeling as they led him into the labyrinth was pure joy of being accepted. But Ethan didn't know the other boys had given the Rangers the wrong head count for their group. So, when they came out hours later without him, the park staff didn't suspect a thing. During their trials, the boys admitted that, one by one, they'd peeled off from Ethan until he was left all alone in the maze. He'd never been in there before, so he didn't know about the signs he could use to find his way, and they hadn't bothered to show him before ditching him. Worst of all, they'd told him it was a short trail, and that the cave was well lit enough that he wouldn't need a flashlight. He didn't bring any food or water, or warm clothes, or even a first aid kit. When the Rangers shut off the lights at closing, Ethan was still inside, totally unprepared, plunged into absolute darkness, and if he yelled for help, nobody heard him. The next morning, Mr. and Mrs. Miller waited for hours for a son who would never come back. Ethan had told them there was going to be a sleepover after the hike, his first one ever. Each of the boys who took him into the labyrinth later testified that they never meant for Ethan to spend a whole night in the cave. They figured, at the very least, he'd be able to solve it before sunset. They were idiots. Ethan was supposed to be home by 10 a.m. the next day, and by noon, the Millers were starting to freak out. They started making calls to other parents, and word spread fast through our small town about the missing boy. It only took a few hours before the whole messed up truth came out. One of the conspirators, scared they'd get in even bigger trouble if Ethan was seriously hurt, or worse than they already were for the little joke they'd played, fessed up to everything. By 2 p.m., a search party was combing every inch of Harrison's cave, at least every inch of the well-mapped public area. They split into teams, and by 6 p.m., most of the maze had been searched. There was no sign of Ethan. But as it was getting dark outside, Mrs. Miller claimed she heard his voice. She swears, even today, that it was him. What mother wouldn't recognize her own son calling for help? But since she was the only one who heard it, some people think maybe her mind was playing tricks on her, because she was so desperate. Anyway, she followed the sound, or whatever it was, to the entrance of the restricted area and demanded they unlock the gate to search in there. "He's just through there. Can't you hear him?" she wailed. It seemed impossible, though. The door was intact and locked properly when the park staff checked it. And Ethan didn't have a key or tools or any experience that anyone knew of that would have let him pick the lock. But they couldn't say no to a hysterical mother. And since they were pretty sure by then that Ethan wasn't anywhere else in the cave, they gave in. Some guys who were familiar with the usually off-limits tunnels went in, and they were shocked to find out that Mrs. Miller was right. A few hundred yards past the gate, they found her son's lifeless body, a scream still frozen on his face. She cursed the men who'd found him for not acting faster, howling through her tears that she'd heard him alive just 30 minutes before they found him. No amount of explaining that it wasn't possible he'd been calling to her could calm her down. Not even when they told her, after they'd examined the body, that Ethan had died at least 16 hours earlier. Nobody was ever formally charged in Ethan's death. It was ruled a tragic accident since there wasn't any evidence to say otherwise. The autopsy didn't find any signs of foul play, but then again, it didn't find any signs of what had killed him, either. All they could confirm was that, at some point, his heart just stopped beating. The boys who played the prank were initially suspected of having murdered Ethan and hidden his body where it was found. But their parents provided alibis for them. The sleepover was real, and all the boys were there when Ethan passed away. The leading theory then became that someone else had taken Ethan beyond the gate and killed him. Someone who maybe stumbled upon him all alone and saw an opportunity to do something terrible. But nobody came forward, and no new evidence turned up. The pranksters got some community service, and the case went cold. After Ethan's death, they decided Harrison's cave needed some serious safety upgrades if it was going to stay open. So, they closed it for a while. They took out the gate to the restricted area and replaced it with 3 feet of solid concrete. They also installed new barriers and cameras at the main entrance and exit. Now, anybody who wanted to tour the labyrinth had to go through these full-height turnstiles manned by park staff when entering and leaving. This was to ensure an accurate count of everyone inside. Any discrepancies could be checked on the cameras, and they guaranteed the public it was foolproof. They even hired a night guard to prevent anyone from sneaking in after hours. It was a pretty basic system, but way better than the old hand count honor system they used before. On each of the turnstiles, there was a button both inside and outside that would unlock it to let someone in or out. This allowed people who wanted to give up on making it all the way through to go back to the entrance and leave that way. Or, for cavers who wanted an extra challenge, to do the maze backward by starting at the exit. As hikers went in and out through either gate, the system would calculate the total number of people inside as well as the total number who entered for the day. Simple. Foolproof. When they reopened, they thought they'd made it impossible for something like the Ethan Miller tragedy to happen again. But they were wrong. When I was 14, the cave claimed my best friend, Noah Baker. And it tried to take me, too. To say Noah was obsessed with the labyrinth would be a massive understatement. By the summer of 2005, he'd already completed it over 40 times. His parents had given him an unlimited pass for his 14th birthday, along with the freedom to go exploring on his own. And since the park where Harrison's cave was located was between his house and our school, and he walked past it every day on his way home, in the first 6 months he had the pass, he explored the maze multiple times a week. He wouldn't stop pestering me to go with him. Noah and I had been best friends since first grade. I was an only child, so he was the closest thing I had to a brother. And even though it cost me $3 every time I gave in, I went into the cave with him a bunch of times, just to support his thing. Though, if I'm being honest, I didn't really get his obsession. To me, it was just another hike. But to Noah, those tunnels were like sacred ground. He used to say he felt some kind of special connection to the place. He was fascinated by it. He'd tell anyone who'd listen that it wasn't just a hole in a hill. It was alive. And he wouldn't be stopped from trying to drag me along every time he went. He was convinced that one day I'd learn to appreciate it like he did. Even though I didn't understand its greatness in the same way, I had to admit there was something, if not impressive, at least weird about it. There was the whole Ethan Miller mystery, and the weird way people forgot things inside. Noah told me that no matter how many times he did it, he still had trouble finding the way out. That was what he loved most about it, the never-ending battle. Him versus the earth itself. A true test of willpower and mental strength. He was determined to unlock all its secrets. I remember my first trip into the labyrinth like it was yesterday. Before we went in, Noah gave me a map of the whole system. He made me study the exact route until I had it memorized and could say every turn back to him perfectly. And once we were inside, I understood why. When we got to the first fork, he asked me, left or right? Annoyed that he was already quizzing me, I confidently said, left. You sure? He asked with this little grin. Yeah, I'm positive, dude. It's the first turn. Pretty hard to forget, I said, kind of offended. Okay then, let's try that way, he said, starting down the tunnel. But 5 minutes later, we hit a dead end. Staring at the solid wall in front of me, I was totally confused about how I'd managed to get the very first turn wrong. Seeing the dumb look on my face, Noah started laughing. Then he just said, don't worry, happens to everyone in here. I've ended up right where you're standing more times than I can count. When we got back to where the path split, I knew we were supposed to go the opposite way from what I'd picked. But looking at the two options, I couldn't remember which one went back to the entrance and which one went deeper into the cave. Still chuckling at my confusion, Noah told me to stand perfectly still with my back to the opening we'd just come from. He reached for a small sign next to the gap on the right hand side. He flipped a little metal latch in the center and pulled down a small wooden flap to reveal the words TOENTRNCE. Hidden behind it, he started imitating our geography teacher, Mrs. Wilkes, who was always like, way too nice, and asked in this super high-pitched, sugary voice. Alright, so now if your back is to the tunnel we just came from, and that one leads to a dead end, and the sign says this way goes back to the entrance, which way do we need to go to move forward? That way. A hole, I snapped, pointing to the only option left. He gave me this fake, overly enthusiastic applause, and I flipped him off before walking ahead. And the rest of the trip was no better. We got lost at least 10 different times. Noah was letting me navigate, and no matter how hard I tried, I might as well have been flipping a coin for how accurately I remembered the route. I'd thought the signs would be more helpful, too. No made it sound like everything was so well marked that even a kid could find their way, but that wasn't really the case. Not every tunnel had a sign, so you had to really focus to make sure you didn't forget which of the unmarked paths you'd already tried. And even the tunnels that did have signs only had hints like TONTRNCE, 2EX a T, or a big X and to show a dead end. It was also super inconsistent from room to room. Some areas were labeled with the way forward, others with the way back. It was a game. I had to admit, even though it was frustrating as hell sometimes, it was a pretty interesting experience. There was something about the place. A quietness you couldn't find anywhere on the outside. When we stopped for a minute in one of the bigger rooms to have some water, and I sat up against the rock wall, I got this feeling like I wanted to stay there forever. A feeling of peace just washed over me. Calmness. Stillness. No had to snap me out of some trance to get me moving again. I reluctantly kept going, and even though it took us almost 3 times as long as it would have taken Noah alone, we eventually found our way to the exit. When we finally made it out, I actually felt really proud of myself, like I'd won some great victory over those ancient tunnels. But once was enough for me. When I got home, I was more exhausted than I'd ever been. Not just from walking around underground for hours, but mentally, I was more drained than any test or homework assignment had ever made me. But Noah was relentless, and every few weeks, I couldn't take his nagging anymore and agreed to go again. And it was on our 4th trip that he said something that made me go from being mildly annoyed by his cave obsession to seriously worried. We'd been hiking for hours. Noah was navigating, and I started to get the feeling he wasn't really trying to find the exit quickly. In fact, I was pretty sure we were going into areas I'd never been to before, but it was hard to tell if that was just the effect the labyrinth had on people. But I became convinced something was wrong when we got to a room that had no exits, and Noah seemed really excited about it. "Found it," he exclaimed, setting his pack down in the middle of the chamber. "Found what?" I asked, not seeing anything about the space that was worth getting excited about. As far as I could tell, we were lost again, and it was going to take a lot of backtracking to get back on the right path. This. He moved toward the far wall, and there, I noticed, was a weird patch in the rock. A slab of gray among the reds and browns. Concrete. He reached forward and ran his fingers over the rock next to it, carefully feeling along the surface, almost like he was searching for a weak spot. "Do you feel it?" he asked me in a low whisper, like he didn't want to disturb something unseen in the room with us. The only thing I was feeling at that moment was serious unease, and a strong urge to pull him away from the wall and get the hell out of there. Without waiting for me to answer, he continued, "It's like there's something behind here. Something pulling me toward it. I can't always find this place. I think they leave it off the maps. Even when I come into the cave specifically looking for it, most of the time I just end up at the exit. But sometimes, if I listen closely, I hear something, a faint voice, always just in the next room. If I follow it, it leads me here." He never turned around while he was talking. I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or to himself. For a second, I thought he was messing with me, trying to scare me, but it was like he'd forgotten I was even there. His behavior sent a chill down my spine. Without thinking, I lowered my voice to match his as I nervously went up to him from behind. "Hey, no, I think we should get out of here," I pleaded. Still staring at the wall, caressing the sealed surface, he replied, "You're right. We should go. It should go. It's not time. Need to come at night. It doesn't like the light." He took his hand off the wall and stepped back. I jumped about a foot in the air when he suddenly went back to his normal voice and asked me, "Dude, what are you doing?" Because I was, right behind him when he turned around, and he almost bumped into me. You were Never mind, can we go? I replied. Yeah. All right, let's get moving, he said, picking up his pack. We made it out without any more weirdness, but Noah wasn't as thrilled as he usually was when we exited. He clicked through the turnstile and signed out with the ranger without his usual excitement. When I asked if he was okay, he said he was just tired, but I could tell he was lying. Need to come at night. Those words kept echoing in my head. I kept thinking about Ethan trapped in the dark. Had he heard someone guiding him to that part of the cave too? Had he felt the pull that Noah described? I tried to talk to him about what happened in that hidden chamber, but he kept brushing it off, acting like nothing weird had happened. Which, I guess, was fair. Yeah, he'd said some creepy stuff. And yeah, the room had made me uneasy, but I reminded myself that Noah had been spending a lot of time alone in a cave. It was possible he was letting Ethan's story get to him, and he was starting to hear things in the silence and all that. I told myself not to worry. Even if Noah wanted to, there was no way he could get into the labyrinth at night. And if he somehow did get past the guard and the cameras, the restricted area was behind 3 feet of concrete. The worst that would happen was he'd have to sleep on a rock floor in a cold, dark room until the rangers found him in the morning. But I still didn't think it was healthy for him to keep spending so much time in there. I used some of the same nagging techniques he'd used on me to get him to play basketball or go fishing instead of running the maze for the 50th time, and I thought it was working. By the middle of August, it had been 3 weeks since he'd even asked me to go on a hike with him. Everything seemed to be going in the right direction, until the evening of August 17th, 2005. Noah never came home from school. It wasn't that unusual that summer for him to come home late. Usually, it just meant he was either with me or in the cave. Back then, it was still pretty rare for kids our age to have cell phones, so the rule at Noah's house was just that he had to be home by 7 p.m. or find a way to call and let them know he'd be late. It was 9 p.m. when the phone rang at my house. I remember my parents waking me up that night. I'd gone to play basketball after school with some guys from our class and had invited Noah to come along. But he said he wasn't feeling well and was just going to walk straight home. I didn't think much of it since he really did look pale that afternoon. I told him to feel better and went off to the courts. Exhausted from the game, I'd fallen asleep early and vividly remember being shaken awake by my worried parents. When they asked if I knew why Noah hadn't come home or where he might be, the words just popped into my head. The labyrinth. I told them about my last conversation with him, that he'd said he was going home, but that if he wasn't there, then he was probably in the maze. But my parents told me that the bakers had already called the park. The guard on duty confirmed that Noah's name wasn't on the list of hikers for the day, and that the system showed exactly 0 people left in the cave. Also, the turnstiles were set to alarm if they moved after closing, and neither the entrance nor the exit had gone off. They were sure he couldn't be there. But in my mind, it was the only place he could be. Noah was smart. And he was at that park so often that, if there was a weakness in their security, I was sure he would have found it. I tried to convince my parents that they should tell the bakers that if they were going to look for him, they should start at the cave, even though it was impossible for him to be there. But they wouldn't listen. They told me to go back to sleep and that the adults would figure it out. They said the police were going to get involved and that they'd probably find him in the next few hours. They promised me that by the time I woke up, he'd be back home. But they didn't count on me not giving a crap about anything, they just said. True, I had convinced myself by then that there were no real dangers in the labyrinth after dark, and it was his own damn fault for sneaking in there. But I had a gut feeling that he was in trouble, that every minute he was in there, his life was at risk. Acting on pure instinct, as soon as my parents left my room, I grabbed a flashlight from the closet and climbed out the window. It was a cool summer night. The damp air smelled like rain was coming. I hopped the back fence and took a shortcut through the woods, picking my way through the trees as fast as my sleepy legs could manage. And as I went, I tried to figure out how he might have done it. The turnstiles they installed blocked both the entrance and exit so that you couldn't get in or out without going through them. Also, the ranger's booth was right between the two and was staffed all the time. The way the rocks naturally funneled people toward the cave, it was impossible to even get to the barriers without passing within a few feet of it. As I thought about how Noah had managed to beat the system, I started to wonder how the hell High was going to do it. With the night guard in the booth, there was no way I was going to sneak by without him seeing me. Even if I could, I'd set off the alarm the second I turned the turnstile to get in. With no time to come up with a good plan, or even a half-decent one, I went with the first thing that came to mind. Brute force. When I got to the mouth of the valley that led down to the cave, I stopped for a second to collect myself, and then I charged. I ran full speed toward the entrance, ignoring the shouts that started as I got closer. My plan was simple. The guard would take a few seconds to get out of the booth once he saw me. If I could put enough distance between us, I was sure that once we were both inside the maze, I could lose him in the tunnels. Right, I chanted as I got to the turnstile, trying to force my brain to remember which way to go at the first fork. I knew from before that as soon as I crossed into the cave, I might forget. I reached the gate and slammed my hand on the button to unlock it, then pushed my way through. And when I did, this ear-splitting alarm started blaring, drowning out the yells of the guy chasing me. Not stopping, I picked up my pace again, refusing to look back to see if I was about to get caught. I focused only on what I had to do. Right. No, left. Wait, no. Right, no. Left. Crap. I was just a few feet past the barrier, and I was already forgetting which way to go. I knew if I chose wrong, I'd end up at a dead end, and probably get caught before I even had a chance to start looking for No. Moving as fast as I dared into the deepening darkness, I realized for the first time what dark really meant. The faint lights along the walls had always been on when I was in there with Noah. Now, with no power, I realized that beyond the beam of my flashlight, I couldn't see a thing. The rangers still turned them off at night, but I had assumed that the guard would switch them on before coming after me. In his hurry to catch me, it looked like he'd forgotten. I wasn't sure if this was better or worse. It would make it harder for me to find my way, but it would also probably make it harder for him to catch me. Better or worse didn't really matter, though. I couldn't change it. Going forward was my only option if I wanted to find my friend. And after a few minutes of careful jogging, I made it to the first fork with enough a lead that when I stopped and risked a look back the way I'd come, I couldn't see his light. I also couldn't hear his shouts or footsteps. Or any sounds at all, actually. I had been so focused on what I was doing that I hadn't noticed the alarm fade out. It had been super loud when it went off, and I was only a few hundred yards away. I figured I should still hear at least some of it. But there was only silence. Left or right, left or right. I asked myself as I moved my light between the openings on either side of the room. Then, out of the silence, a whisper reached my ears. Liam. I'm sure I would have freaked out and run if my adrenaline hadn't already been so high, but I was on a mission, and the voice calling my name sounded familiar. Noah. I replied as calmly as I could. A small feeling of relief broke through, thinking I might have found him already. This way, it replied. Which way? Where are you? I pointed my flashlight toward the right-hand tunnel, where the barely audible words seemed to be coming from. Down here. It answered from just beyond my light. Getting annoyed that he was hiding from me, I snapped. Dude, stop screwing around and come out here. Let's just turn ourselves into the guard and go home. No. You follow. I will show the way, came the cryptic reply. A light started to bob along the walls behind me. I didn't have much time to decide. Hurry. He is coming, the voice urged. I wasn't sure why he wouldn't come with me, but I figured maybe he was trying to keep me from getting caught, to keep me out of trouble. With the window to choose quickly closing, and finding it hard to think straight, I nervously turned to the path on the right and went forward, hoping I'd find Noah just ahead. I was frustrated when I got to the next fork and he still hadn't shown up. This way. The voice came from the left branch. I opened my mouth to ask why he hadn't come out yet, but it cut me off. Follow, it demanded. Deeper I went into the maze, following the voice's directions at every turn. After the 5th turn, I wasn't worried about the guard finding me anymore. I was sure that at some point, our paths had split, and I was way beyond his reach. But I was starting to worry about where I was being led. It was Noah. I could swear it was Noah. I'd known him for 7 years. We'd grown up together. I was sure it was his voice. But there was something off about it. A gravelly undertone beneath the usual sarcastic pitch. And why wouldn't he show his face? Why did he keep staying just out of sight? I started to think about the stories of Ethan Miller. But those were just stories. After what felt like hours and countless twists through narrow tunnels, I came to a room with only one exit across from the way I'd come in. Stop. The voice directed from the tunnel ahead. Why? Where am I? I asked. Almost there, it replied. Turn it off. What? Was all I could manage to say, totally confused. The light, so bright it hissed. The flashlight was the only thing keeping me from totally panicking at that point. The little bit of light it gave off was my only comfort. No. Are you crazy? I can barely see as it is. I pleaded. It switched from demanding to a soft plea. For me long. Turn it off. I will meet you then. For the first time since I'd entered, I detected a hint of movement from the opening in front of me. He was close. I wanted to get to him. That was the whole reason I was there. But I wasn't about to give up my only source of light so easily. Moving forward, I reached the entrance to the tunnel without doing what it asked. Then it insisted more forcefully. No light. It hurts. I couldn't see the end of the path past a small curve, but it looked like I could feel my way through if I ran my hand along the wall. Thinking that maybe Noah had been in the cave for so long that his eyes were super sensitive, and even my weak flashlight was hurting them, I decided to turn it off. I didn't want to hurt him. Nervously, I clicked off the flashlight and plunged myself into total darkness. Good. Follow. With nothing to see, I kept the fingertips of my right hand on the rock surface, while putting the flashlight in my back pocket. Then, putting my left hand out in front of me to avoid running face first into something, I carefully tiptoed forward. Eventually, after what felt like forever, I felt the tunnel open up into a larger space. Yes, good. This way. Come this way. Nearly there. Come to me. The voice was leading me across an open cavern. I wildly waved my arms around, waiting to touch something, praying I'd see Noah soon. But it was only guiding me to another passageway. When my hands finally hit a hard surface, I felt a thin crack in the rock, just wide enough for me to squeeze through. Come through. Come through. Join us, US, I yelped. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Noah's voice had mixed with others I didn't recognize. The grating tone was now impossible to ignore. I backed away from the wall and grabbed the flashlight from my pocket. Pointing it out in front of me, I clicked it on to find the concrete wall of the sealed chamber. And next to it, where there should have been nothing but solid rock, there was a hole where one shouldn't be. I shone my light down the impossible tunnel, and it landed on a figure at the other end. It was there for only a second, the briefest instant, but I couldn't mistake it. No. Or at least something pretending to be him. It was a good imitation, except for the eyes, which glowed in the light, reflecting like some creature from the deep ocean, and the skin was cracked, hard like stone. Whatever it was let out a feral shriek before disappearing into the darkness. Fear took over my desire to save my friend. I ran in the opposite direction, terror ripping through my chest, not knowing if that etched thing would chase me. Sprinting back down the tunnel that had brought me within feet of what I was sure would have been my death, I made it back to the previous room when I was suddenly blinded. The main lights kicked on throughout the cave. I was saved. The guard had decided after 30 minutes of looking for me in the dark that it would be best to call for backup. It took him almost. This laptop feels like a ton of bricks, and my hands are still doing that weird tingly thing. Maybe it's the cold, maybe it's something else. Doesn't matter. I gotta write this down before the memories get all fuzzy. Before I start thinking I made the whole thing up. We never should have gone on that damn trip. It all started with Ethan's big news. He practically kicked down my apartment door, waving a set of keys around like he just hit the jackpot. Guess what? He yelled, grinning like an idiot. If this is about another one of your dumb late-night stunts. Olivia started from the kitchen, not even bothering to look at him. She's used to his drama. Relax, Ethan said, throwing himself onto the couch next to Chloe. This isn't stupid. It's awesome. I got us an RV. Chloe raised an eyebrow, her laptop screen reflecting the skeptical look on her face. You got an RV? Like, you own it now? Ethan shook his head. No, I borrowed it. My cousin owed me a favor. Thing runs great. Yeah. Define gret, I said, finally looking up from my notebook. Engine purrs like a kitten, Ethan said. Heater works. Stove's good. Beds are, well, they're beds. And best of all, it's free. No hotels, no tents. Just us, the open road, and... The smell of rust, Olivia interrupted, walking over with her coffee mug. It does not smell like rust. Ethan shot back, pretending to be offended. Does it even have tires? Chloe asked, smirking now. Ethan ignored her. I'm serious, guys. This is perfect. We've been talking about a trip forever, right? Well, here it is. Northern Wisconsin, beautiful snow, covered campground. A real camping trip. Champing, I asked, putting my pen down. You do realize it's, like, the dead of winter, right? In Wisconsin. And there's a massive cold front coming. People die doing this crap. Ethan waved me off. Dude, chill. It's not like we're scaling Mount Everest. We'll park the RV, take some pics, roast some marshmallows. You'll thank me when you're Insta famous. SM doesn't even have Instagram, Chloe pointed out. Exactly my point, Ethan replied. Olivia took a sip of her coffee, eyeing him over the rim of her mug. What happens if this Gret RV breaks down in the middle of nowhere? Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms. Then I fix it. Duh. Yeah, Chloe said, closing her laptop. Because you're such a master mechanic. I know enough, Ethan said defensively. Olivia looked at me. What do you think, Sam? I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say hell no, but the way Ethan was looking at me, all hopeful and puppy dog eyes, it was hard to resist. Plus, the idea of getting out of town for a bit did sound kind of nice. I sighed. Fine. But if this thing dies, you're walking back to town, not me. Ethan grinned. Deal. The trip started out okay. Better than okay, actually. The road was stretching out in front of us, snow coming down light and easy, dusting the trees and the two-lane highway. The RV rattled here and there, but Ethan seemed to know what he was doing behind the wheel. Chloe's dog, a fluffy goofball named Buster, was sprawled out on the floor, snoring softly. Chloe was in the passenger seat, snapping pictures like crazy. Olivia was in the back, organizing our supplies. Who packed this much junk food? She yelled from the back. It's called being prepared, I yelled back. Ethan glanced at me in the rearview mirror. Junk food. What happened to your whole health is wealth thing? It's emergency junk food, I shot back. Chloe laughed. You're totally the guy who brings Monopoly to a frat party, aren't you? He is. Fun fact, Monopoly ruins friendships. Ethan said, tapping on the steering wheel. Only if you suck at it, I said. We kept up the trash talk for a while. The kind of easy banter you have with people you've known forever. But a few hours in, the first sign of trouble popped up. It started with a sound, a low, kind of sputtering noise under the hum of the engine. Chug chug. Chug thunk. What was that? Olivia asked, poking her head into the front. Ethan frowned, tapping the dashboard. Probably just the cold let meek. Clunk. The RV shuddered and just stopped. Ethan swore under his breath and turned the key again. Click, click, nothing. Ethan, Chloe said slowly, please tell me you can fix this. He sighed, already pulling on his jacket. It's probably nothing major. I'll take a look. He hopped out, the door slamming shut behind him with a loud thud. A blast of freezing air hit us right away. Chloe zipped up her coat while Olivia started digging out blankets. Great, I muttered. No what? I looked out the window. Nothing but a white blur of snow and trees as far as the eye could see. I guess we wait, Olivia said. Ethan will figure it out. Buster whined, his ears perked up. The wind outside was picking up, howling through the trees and whistling against the RV. Ethan climbed back in after about 10 minutes, his boots tracking snow onto the floor. His face was all red from the cold, and his jaw was clenched tight. Well, Olivia asked, her voice tight. It's the fuel line, Ethan said, shaking snow off his jacket. It's frozen solid. I don't have the tools to fix it out here. Chloe rubbed her hands together, blowing on them. So, what does that mean? We're stuck. For now, Ethan admitted, glancing at me. I'll call for help in the morning when it's lighter out. Wait, why not call now? I asked. Ethan held up his phone, the screen showing a single, pathetic bar of service. Welcome to the boonies. I'll have to hike out until I get a signal. Olivia groaned and slumped into the corner seat. Great. This is how every horror movie starts. Relax, Ethan said, forcing a grin. It's not that bad. We've got food, blankets, and each other. Worst case, we hike to a ranger station tomorrow. Because hiking through a blizzard is so much better, Olivia muttered, pulling her coat tighter. It's not a blizzard yet, Chloe said, looking out the window. It's just snowing. Kind of pretty, actually. We all looked. She wasn't wrong. The snow was falling in these soft, fluffy flakes, coating everything in white. The headlights lit up the empty road ahead, and for a second, it was almost peaceful. Then Buster started growling. It was a low, rumbling growl, his ears pinned back, and he was staring at the door like he wanted to rip it off its hinges. Hey boy, I said softly, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. What's up? He didn't stop growling, his whole body tense. Maybe he heard an animal, Chloe suggested. Olivia frowned. An animal? Out here? In the middle of winter? What would be dumb enough to be out in this cold? Ethan stood up and walked to the door, cracking it open just enough to stick his head out. The rush of cold air made us all shiver. See anything? I asked. Nope, he said, shutting the door quickly. Just snow and trees. Buster kept on growling. A couple of hours later, we were trying to get settled in for the night. Ethan and Olivia rigged up a system of blankets and jackets to try and keep us warm, while Chloe was trying to get Buster to chill out. I don't get it, she said, scratching his back. He's usually so calm on trips. Maybe he's just picking up on our bad vibes, I said. Why is it so freaking cold in here? Olivia said, huddled in a corner with her arms crossed. The weather report didn't say anything about it dropping below freezing. Ethan chuckled dryly. Hey, it's not like we're totally screwed. We've got camping gear. If it keeps getting colder, we can light a fire outside. And risk freezing to death faster, Olivia shot back. What do you want me to say? It's better than sitting in here and complaining. Can you two not? I said, cutting in before things got heated. Let's just focus on staying warm and figure the rest out in the morning. The tension eased up a little, but it was still there, hanging in the air like a bad smell. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind moan against the RV. I took in a deep breath. I needed to get outside for a moment before trying to sleep. When I opened up the rear doors, I saw them. Footprints. The snow outside was untouched except for a line of small, barefoot, childlike prints leading from the trees to the RV's front door. "Ooh, guys," I said, my voice soft. Chloe looked up first, her eyes squinting as she followed my gaze. "What are those?" Ethan walked over and glanced down. "Footprints. They're small," I said. Like a kid. Olivia joined us, choosing to peer out of the frosted window. "A kid? Out here? That doesn't make any sense." We stared for a moment. The strange, meandering path of prints seemed completely unworried. They had stopped just short of the door. We didn't say anything, but we all noticed that none of the prints were leading away. Buster growled again from behind us, low and insistent, his nose pointed towards the open door. Ethan shook his head. "Maybe it's from an animal that just sort of looks like footprints. Snow can mess with shapes." "Yeah," Chloe chirped in, unconvincingly. No one wanted to admit what we were really thinking. Deep in the tree line, I thought I heard something. A faint floating sound. A laugh high and breathy, like a breeze being swept through the trees. "Did you hear that?" Olivia whispered, her eyes wide. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah." By the time the first light of dawn peeked through the trees, none of us had slept. Not really, anyway. Olivia had dozed off for a few minutes, her head slumped against the wall, but every creak of the RV made her jolt awake. Chloe had stayed curled up with Buster, one hand clutching his fur, the other pressed to her mouth, searching for those hot little bursts of breath. Ethan sat yawning in the front seat, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. I didn't fare much better. I just stared out the window, watching as the snow piled higher and higher around us. The frost from the outside started to creep across the metal of the RV walls. "All right," Ethan said eventually, clapping his hands together. "Here's the plan. Me and Sam head out, try to find the main road or a ranger station. Worst case, we flag someone down." Olivia sat up sharply. "Are you serious? It's gotta be in the single digits. And not on the positive side. What's the alternative?" Ethan sighed. "We just sit here and wait to freeze our asses off." Olivia gestured at the iced-over windows. "You think hiking through that is a better idea?" "Why have to do something?" Ethan snapped, running a hand through his hair. "The RV's dead, the heater's barely hanging on, and we can't just..." "Stop." Chloe's voice cut through the argument. She looked pale, her eyes darting between us. "Can we please not fight right now? We're all scared. Let's think this through." Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Fine ideas." I hesitated. "What about a fire? We've got wood matches. If we can melt some of this ice, maybe we can make the heater last longer." "That's not terrible," Ethan admitted. Olivia crossed her arms. "It's better than splitting up and wandering out into the storm." "Okay," Ethan said. "Fire it is." The fire should have helped. In theory, it should have been simple: clear a spot in the snow, stack some wood, and let the flames do the rest. But the moment we stepped outside, the cold wrapped around us like a living thing. The wind felt like needles, going right through our layers like they weren't even there. "God," Olivia muttered, clutching her coat. "It's even colder than last night." When we hopped off of the back of the RV, our feet slid straight to the ground. The snow underfoot gave away too easily, falling away from our boots without compacting. It was like stepping into powdered ash. We didn't think too much about it, though. Ethan and I were too focused on clearing a patch for the fire. It was easier than it should have been, like moving around fake snow from a TV set. It wasn't long before we had the wood and kindling set up. Ethan brought the flame from the lighter down towards the pit. Puffed. The flame flickered and died before it got anywhere near the kindling. Ethan swore under his breath. He tried a thing. The cold was getting worse. "Here, try this one," Chloe said, handing him another lighter. Click. The flame barely lasted a second before a gust of wind swallowed it. "Come on," he muttered, fumbling with the switch. "Maybe we should just go back inside." Chloe said, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. I was about to agree when I heard the faint, tinny sound of an old music box. Plink, plink, plunk, plink. The melody was distant at first, almost delicate, as though it didn't want to interrupt us. It gently crept into the clearing between the trees, carried on the wind, growing louder with each note. Cheerful and steady, yet unmistakably offbeat. Like a nursery rhyme slowed to a crawl. We followed the noise towards a strip of barren snow that used to be called a road. Then, through the tree line, we watched as a figure slid out into the open. It wasn't sudden. There was no jolt of shock, no moment of panic. It arrived as though it had every right to be there. And for a brief moment, we thought it might be someone who could help us. The figure wore a long, black tailored coat, with a wide, brimmed hat that was tilted at an almost careless angle. But the face that was hidden beneath it was something that I wish I could forget. It was smooth, pale, and polished. Not a single wrinkle on its head. Its features were just slightly off enough that it felt too close to being human. Just close enough to be wrong. The eyes were large and completely black, like carved pieces of polished coal. There was a faint, reflective shine to them that glimmered from the snow. Its nose was delicately thin, sharp and long, and the mouth, thin and uncomfortably wide, curved upward in a slight performative smile. It stopped in the middle of the road, placing one hand over its chest. Then, with a singular fluid motion, it bent over at the waist into a deep bow, its hat almost brushing against the snow. None of us moved. We froze. We watched as the figure straightened, reaching into its coat with a calm, precise motion. It withdrew something small, something metal that caught the pale light of the clearing. A music box topped with a dancing ballerina. Its long, gloved fingers shifted over to the crank, turning it slowly, deliberately. The melody twisted and warped with each turn, the sound becoming clearer and sharper as though it were summoning the air itself to attention. The ballerina began twirling. Olivia broke from her trance. She took a half step backward, her boots crunching softly against the snow. The figure turned its head toward her, the motion unnervingly confident, the glint of its black eyes reflecting her movement. It raised its arms up in a flourish. Then the children appeared. They came one by one, stepping out from the tree line with an odd sort of playfulness, skipping and spinning as they emerged. Their bare feet left no marks in the snow. I counted 6, maybe 7 children. Their silhouettes were half obscured by the swirling snow. Jesus, Ethan breathed. The figure raised one arm, a sharp, controlled gesture that froze the children in place. They stood there, still as statues, before their faces finally turned toward us. Even through the snow, we could tell they were wrong. Their eyes were too small, their mouths too wide. Frost rimed their cheeks and hair, and their expressions never from anything other than excitement. The figure tilted its head, as if inviting us to react to their little show. Inside, I whispered, my voice dry. Olivia didn't need telling twice. She turned and bolted back towards the RV door, grabbing Chloe's arm and yanking her along. Ethan grabbed my arm, pulling me back as the figure took a single step forward, its footfall utterly silent. We slammed the door shut behind us, fumbling with the lock until our stiffening fingers prevailed. Olivia was already yanking the blinds closed. Meanwhile, the sound of the music box hadn't stopped. What the hell was that? Olivia stammered, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Ethan didn't answer. He was pacing back and forth near the door, peeking through a crack in the blinds. They were kids, Chloe said softly, her voice distant. Did everyone else see them? They weren't kids, I muttered. Buster was growling again, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor. His hackles were raised, and he was scratching at the door, whining. We waited, quiet, hoping somehow it's to go away. But then came the knock. It was a single, deliberate tap at the door. We all turned to face it. Another knock followed, calm and measured. Buster barked sharply, throwing himself against the door. His claws scratched at the metal, but the sound barely seemed to register over the rising tension. "Don't," I whispered as Ethan moved toward the blinds. He ignored me, pulling them back just enough to peek outside again. He froze, his face draining of color. He quickly took a step back. "What is it?" Olivia asked, her voice shaking. "He's closer," Ethan murmured. I forced myself to look. Through the narrow gap in the blinds, I saw him. The man stood just outside the RV, his face tilted upward like he was admiring a piece of art. Behind him, the children had gathered. They stood in a loose semicircle, their heads tilted in unison, their wide, frozen eyes staring directly at the RV. It looked like they were about to sing a carol. The man moved. Slowly, he reached out and adjusted the brim of his hat, then withdrew the music box again. His long fingers won the crank with a slow, deliberate motion. The melody shifted, the notes warping into a new tune, something higher, lighter. The children swayed gently. One of them giggled. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a knife, sharp and high-pitched. Another joined in, then another, their laughter blending with the music until it was impossible to tell where one sound ended and the other began. "What do they want?" Olivia whispered, her back pressed against the far wall. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The figure tilted its head again, as if he had heard her question. Then, with a gentle motion, he raised a long finger and softly tapped against the frosted window. The sound crisp and deliberate. Chloe whimpered, curling into herself. "They're going to come inside." "No," Ethan said firmly. "They can't get in." The figure tapped the glass again, this time with more force. A spider web of frost began to spread outward from where his finger had pressed against the pane. "Ethan," I said, my throat hoarse. "Step back." He didn't move, his eyes locked on the frost as it crept across the window. The figure's black eyes seemed to regard the frosted glass with amusement. Then the music stopped, cutting off mid-note. The voice replaced it. "Won't you come outside?" It wasn't loud, but it felt like it came from everywhere all at once. The voice was sharp, smooth, and layered, as though every word cracked into dozens of smaller voices. Olivia flinched, pressing her hands over her ears. Ethan backed away from the door. "We're not going anywhere," he yelled, his voice shaking. The figure dropped its head, almost as if it were in contemplation. Then with a single movement it turned the crank on the music box again, the melody resuming, now faster, harsher. The children began to move, their hands tapping softly against the RV, their eyes never leaving the windows. The frost on the glass began to spread inward like creeping vines. "They're coming in," Chloe said, her voice flat. "No," Ethan snapped, grabbing a knife from the counter. "They're not getting in here." The door rattled violently, the metal groaning under the strain. Buster barked again, louder this time, throwing himself against the base of the door as though he could hold it closed. The music swelled, filling every corner of the RV. The encroaching ice raced across the walls, the floor, the ceiling, encasing everything in a thin, brittle layer. The door gave a final, shuddering rattle, and then it stopped. The music cut off again. We stood frozen, the silence almost unbearable. The frost-covered walls creaked softly, but nothing moved, nothing spoke. "They're gone," Ethan said after a long moment. Chloe shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "They're still out there." The air inside grew colder with each passing second, crawling into our skin, our lungs, our bones. The frost wasn't just on the walls anymore. It was covering us. A thin layer of ice clung to Ethan's jacket, to Olivia's hair, and even to Buster's fur. It spread with a controlled sluggishness. I noticed my fingers first. They tingled, then turned numb. I flexed them, trying to shake it off. But the stiffness didn't go away. My gloves felt like they weren't there anymore, as if the cold had seeped straight through the fabric right into the flesh. "We need to move," Ethan muttered, his voice trembling. He tried to walk, but his knees buckled, and he slumped onto the kitchen seat. "Ethan." Olivia's voice cracked. Are you okay?" She took a step towards him. Her lips were cracked and purple, Her cheeks had already lost all their color. Ethan didn't reply, just stared at his hands. His gloves were frozen stiff, the fabric cracking as he tried to flex his fingers. He peeled one off, and I gagged. His fingertips were white, almost translucent, with deep, angry cracks that bled sluggishly. The skin along his knuckles had split open, exposing raw, purple flesh beneath. "I can't feel them," he said, his voice distant. I can't feel anything," Olivia whimpered, pulling her own hands close to her chest. I tried to speak, but my lips wouldn't move right. My tongue felt thick and uncoordinated, like it was stuck to the roof of my mouth. I reached up, brushing at my face, and froze. My cheek was hard to the touch, the skin taut and unyielding. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, barely fogging the air, and when I exhaled, I saw tiny flecks of ice falling from my lips. "Sam." Chloe's voice was faint, barely audible. She was still sitting by the window, her arms wrapped around Buster, who was lying unnaturally still. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy, and her breath came in weak, uneven gasps. She looked down at Buster, her hands trembling. His fur was matted with frost, his nose coated in a thin layer of ice. His chest didn't rise. "Buster," Chloe whispered, shaking him gently. "Buster, come on. Wake up." He didn't move. Her trembling turned violent, and she let out a strangled cry, pressing her face into his frozen fur. "No, no, no." The sound snapped something in me. I stumbled toward her, my legs barely cooperating, every step sending sharp jolts of pain up my frozen feet. I knelt beside her, reaching out, but she flinched away, clutching Buster tighter. "We're freezing," Olivia said suddenly, her voice sharp and slurred. Her teeth chattered violently, her body shaking. We're freezing to death." No," Ethan muttered, his voice thick. His eyes sluggishly flitted around the RV. "No, we're not. We can't be. We're inside. The heat's on. We're dying," Olivia murmured under her broken breath. Her words hung in the air, sharp and jagged. I staggered back to my feet, grabbing the edge of the counter for support. My head was spinning, my vision blurred at the edges, and my heart felt like it was slowing. Then I saw it. The frost on the window had cleared, just enough to reveal a single black eye staring in. My breath caught in my throat. The man's face was pressed against the glass, its lips pulled into that faint, thin smile. It blinked once, slowly, almost lazily. Olivia sobbed, fully collapsing onto the floor. "Why is it watching us? Why is it just watching?" Ethan began to laugh, a low, strained sound that turned into a cough. He wheezed, his breath rattling. Is it getting warmer in here?" The creature's black eyes shifted slightly, locking onto me. It raised one gloved hand and tapped gently on the glass, the sound soft but punctual. My body convulsed involuntarily, my limbs jerking as I tried to move, to run, to do anything. But I couldn't look away from those eyes, black and endless, swallowing everything they saw. I sank to the floor, my strength draining away. We were freezing, and it was waiting. Chloe stirred first. Her movements were slow, almost hesitant, as though she were waking from a dream. She didn't say anything. She just stood up, staring down at Buster's frozen body with a strange, distant look on her face. "Chloe," I'd whisper, "you doing?" She didn't respond. Her trembling hands slid under Buster's stiff body, and with a strength I didn't think she had left, she lifted him into her arms. The frost cracked and splintered as his limbs shifted. "Chloe, stop," Olivia rasped, her voice faint and broken. "Where are you going?" But Chloe didn't listen. She stood unsteadily, her legs shaking beneath her, and turned toward the door. "Chloe, no." Ethan reached out, but his body was weak. The effort made him cough violently. She didn't look back. Her pale, frostbitten hands fumbled with the lock, the metal screeching softly as it turned. The door creaked open, and the cold rushed in. "Chloe, please." I tried to stand again, but my legs gave out beneath me, sending me sprawling onto the frozen floor. "Don't go out there." She hesitated in the doorway, the wind catching her hair, tossing it around her face like brittle threads. For a moment, she looked back at us. Her eyes were strange, glassy. almost peaceful. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'll be warm soon." Then she stepped outside, the door swinging shut behind her with a hollow clang. With all my strength, I pulled myself up to a window. Through the frost-covered glass, I watched as Chloe carried Buster into the clearing. Her movements were slow and mechanical, her head bowed against the wind. The snow swirled around her, fluttering in strange, erratic patterns. The creature watched her approach, its black eyes glinting with faint amusement. The children walked towards her, swaying with every step, their smiles widening. Chloe sank to her knees in the snow, cradling Buster's body. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, fogging the air around her face. I watched as frost crept up her arms, her legs, her cheeks, but she didn't move. The creature stepped forward, its coat billowing slightly in the wind. It crouched low, its movements precise and deliberate, and extended a hand toward Chloe. Her breathing slowed, her head tilted upward, her glassy eyes locking onto the creature's face. I don't know if she took its hand, or if it just hovered there. But she smiled, just for a moment, before her body slumped forward. Her arms went limp, and Buster's frozen body fell into the snow beside her. I slumped down against the RV walls and closed my eyes. When I managed to open them again, I noticed how far the ice had advanced. It had crawled up the walls, pooled in the corners, and spread like veins across the floor. Olivia was curled up on the floor, her head pulled to the side, her lips stained a deep, unnatural blue. Her breaths were faint, so faint they seemed to stop at times before resuming with a shallow wheeze. But Ethan wasn't breathing at all. His body sat rigid in the seat, his head bowed forward as though in deep contemplation. His face was gaunt, the pale skin stretched tightly over his cheekbones, while his hands were frozen mid, clenched like sprawling claws. His eyes were wide and glossy, staring through a layer of frost. Olivia's shallow breathing eventually fully slowed. Her chest rose and fell with longer pauses in between, her face slack, her eyelids fluttering before sinking shut. Whatever part of her was still fighting to stay conscious was losing. I couldn't look at her anymore. I could feel the same numbness creeping over me, a heaviness pulling me under. It wasn't sudden, it was maddeningly slow, creeping into my head until the edges of my vision softened. My hands no longer felt like mine. I tried to lift them, to reach for something, anything, but they stayed limp at my sides. The world around me dimmed, retreating into a strange, hazy fog. The shapes in the RV grew indistinct. The door creaked. The sound sliced through the fog, jarring and unnatural. I forced my eyes to focus, but it felt like trying to see through a frozen lens. The door had opened. The man stepped inside. He moved with unhurried care. His boots were soundless against the slick floor. I couldn't turn my head to follow him, but I saw him out of the corner of my eye, tall and angular, the brim of his hat brushing against the low ceiling. His presence filled the room like a heavy weight. He passed by me without a glance, his gaze fixed on Olivia. He stopped beside her, leaning down slowly, his face close to hers. Those black, glinting eyes studied her slack expression, like they were looking beneath her skin. And then the man turned toward me. He smiled, just slightly, just enough. I tried to move, to scream, to do anything, but I was a spectator trapped in my own body. My breath caught in my throat, frozen along with the rest of me. All I could do was meet its gaze. Then the headlights hit. A sudden blinding flash of light cut through the RV. My vision burned white, and for a moment, I thought I heard the creature's footstep falter. When the spots cleared from my eyes, it was gone. The door swung open, the snow swirling violently outside, but there was no trace of the figure, no sign it had ever been there. My mind finally slipped. I woke to the soft beeping of a heart monitor and the rhythmic hiss of an oxygen mask. The hospital room was sterile and bright. I noticed that my body felt heavy and strange, stiff like it wasn't entirely mine. A nurse stood at my bedside, adjusting something on an IV stand. She turned when she noticed my eyes open, her expression softening with relief. "Welcome back," she said quietly, offering a faint smile. I tried to speak, but my throat was raw. Water. She handed me a cup, and I drank. The liquid seared its way down my throat. It hurt, but at least it felt like something. "Where's Olivia?" I asked, my voice rasping. Her expression shifted, her smile fading into something more careful. "She's next door," she said softly. "She's stable, but not awake yet." I nodded, closing my eyes briefly. Olivia was alive. That was enough. The hours blurred together, my body trapped in a haze of pain and exhaustion. When I finally had the strength to sit up, I asked to see Olivia. The doctor hesitated but eventually agreed, guiding me slowly down the hall. My legs felt unsteady beneath me, my steps dragging against the polished floor. When I reached her room, I stopped in the doorway. Olivia looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, her pale face almost blending into the stark white of the sheets. Her chest rose and fell faintly, and the machines around her beeped steadily, indifferent to how fragile she looked. I hesitated, then shuffled forward and sat beside her. Her skin had the same off-color pallor as mine, like the frost had left a stain. I watched her breathe, each rise and fall of her chest a small reassurance that she was still here, still alive. After a while her eyes fluttered open. She squinted against the light, then turned her head to me. Her lips parted in a faint smile. "You're awake," I said, my voice hoarse. The relief that flooded through me was almost enough to push the other feelings away. "Yeah," she murmured, her voice rough and weak. "What happened?" "I don't know," I said. "But we're alive." She nodded slowly, but there was no relief in her expression. Her gaze drifted past me, out of focus, like she was looking through the walls. "For now," she whispered. I didn't know what to say. I turned my attention to the window, watching the snow swirl against the glass. Then the TV sputtered on. The sound cut through the silence with a sudden, violent hiss of static. I flinched, turning toward the corner of the room where the screen glowed faintly. No one had touched the remote. "Did you turn it on?" I asked Olivia. My voice sounded far away. She shook her head weakly. The screen flickered again, the static thick and noisy, lines of distortion rippling through the image. For a moment, nothing happened. It was just chaos on the screen, noise clawing at our ears. Then the static shifted, and the picture began to clear. Shapes emerged. Faint, shadowy figures moving within the gray haze. A slow, warped melody played faintly in the background, growing louder as the picture sharpened. The tune was familiar. A song from a 70s TV special. "If you try to turn around, when you hear his icy sound." "No," Olivia whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but I saw the fear in her wide, glassy eyes. The song continued, each word sharper and more distorted, crawling out of the speakers. "He's sure to disappear, but yes, you know." The screen glitched violently, the shapes twisting and contorting. For a moment, I thought I saw something. Figure standing still in the static, its dark form motionless, its wide-brimmed hat unmistakable. Then, Jack Frost is here. The screen went black. "Turn it off," Olivia rasped. "It's already off," I said. Olivia stared at the blank screen, her breath shallow and uneven. Her lips trembled as she spoke. "It's not gone," she said, her voice rattling. "It's never going to leave." I didn't answer. My eyes were still locked on the TV, waiting for the static to return. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought I could hear the faint, tinny sound of a music box. "All right, let's do this." "So, Yellowstone, right? Probably the most famous park on the planet. I mean, who hasn't heard of it? You've got these insane forests, crazy wildlife, and of course, geysers shooting boiling water into the sky like the morning glory pool. Seriously, this thing looks like a giant rainbow gemstone someone sliced open, all reds, yellows, and these insane blues. You'd pay a fortune just to see it. And then there's the volcano. Yeah, you heard that right. This gigantic underground supervolcano that's, active. And if this thing blows, it's basically game over for everyone. But hey, No need to freak out. We're safey for now. By the time it decides to go boom, we'll probably all be chilling on Mars, watching the fireworks from a safe distance. Hopefully. Anyway, the park is gorgeous, no doubt. I'm sure it's on everyone's bucket list, especially Americans. You see thousands of people there every day, all year round, from all over the world. Different states, different countries, you name it. They come in all excited, and they leave looking like they just had the time of their lives. I loved watching them, honestly. But now I'm worried sick about them. Okay, let me rewind a bit. To keep things on the down low, for me and everyone else in this story, let's just say my name is Alex, and the other two are gonna be Chloe and Ben. Basic, I know, but it works. So, Chloe, Ben, and I have been working at the park for a few years. Ben and I are rangers, and Chloe actually works at the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory. She's my sister-in-law, actually. Introduced me to the job opening not long after she married my brother. I owe her big time for that. Now, I'm just hoping she'll believe me when I tell her what happened. It all started about a week and a half ago. These campers came out of the woods, telling Ben and me about some weird stuff. They said the trip was great, but they kept hearing this noise. Hey, deep rumbling noise, they called it. Said they felt it as much as they heard it. Ben and I were clueless. We just figured they were imagining things. But then we heard it too. This faint, distant rumble, but it was definitely there. It was low and powerful. And then some other campers started reporting seeing trees shaking way off in the distance, like something was pushing them. I thought maybe it was a bison stampede, but the rumbling didn't sound like that. I've heard stampedes before, and this was different. I had this nagging feeling, like I knew what it was, but I just couldn't put my finger on it. You know, like when you're taking a test and you know the answer, but your brain just freezes. Then Ben joked, maybe it's the volcano. We laughed, but that's when it hit me. What if it was the volcano? I mean, tremors and stuff happen. They get picked up by those seismograph things, but not like this. Not where we could all hear it, and it was shaking trees. Not that I could remember, anyway. I started seriously freaking out. I tried to tell myself it was something else. If it was the volcano, wouldn't more trees be shaking? And wouldn't Chloe have called? Or someone from the observatory? They'd tell us if something was up, or at least tell us it was nothing to worry about. But my gut wouldn't listen. I was convinced it was the worst-case scenario. So, I called Chloe. And guess what? She said everything was fine. No seismic activity, no tremors, nothing. In fact, she said things had been unusually calm. I was relieved, obviously, but that just made the whole rumbling thing even weirder. After another day of the usual routine, which, by the way, kept getting interrupted by that damn rumble, I decided I had to figure this out. We couldn't have something freaking out the visitors. I talked to Ben about it, grabbed some gear, and hopped on one of those mountain bikes. I headed deep into the woods. Since I knew it wasn't the volcano, I wasn't too nervous about the animals. Deer and coyotes avoid people, bison are chill unless you mess with them, and wolves know humans aren't on the menu. We had a kind of understanding with them. I kept thinking, what could it be? Illegal logging. Some idiot kids throwing a rave in the woods. I finally got to this empty campsite and stopped to catch my breath. And that's when I heard it again. The rumbling, but different this time. It was further away, lasted longer, and then I saw them. A huge wave of brown crashing through the trees. A bison stampede, maybe 100 yards away. They were packed tight, protecting the calves, thundering across this clearing. Then, they took a sharp left and disappeared into another part of the forest. I was just glad they weren't heading towards any people. I waited for the wolves, figuring they were chasing them. But nothing. No wolves. No nothing. And that wasn't a normal migration. Those bison were terrified. They were running from something, but there was nothing there. No wolves, no bears, nothing. That's when I really started to worry. Maybe it was people messing around, scaring the animals. I grabbed my walkie-talkie. Hey, Ben, just saw a bison stampede near one of the campsites. They were spooked. Over. A moment later, Ben's voice came through. Roger that. Any wolves or anything chasing them? Over. Negative. I think someone's out here messing with the wildlife. I'm gonna check it out. Over. Another pause. All right, but be careful. If it seems too dangerous, come back and we can regroup and decide what to do there. Some visitors could get hurt if this keeps up. Last we need is someone being run over by a 1-ton cattle. Over. Bar. Roger that. I put the walkie-talkie away and kept going, following the direction the bison had come from. I was going slow, being careful. But the deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. It was like something was trying to slow me down, telling me to turn back. My gut was churning and my mouth was dry. Something was seriously wrong. I started regretting this whole thing. I thought about turning back, getting Ben, calling the cops, maybe never coming back to this damn park again. And then, I broke through the tree line and I almost flipped the bike. I slammed on the brakes so hard. Right there, in front of me, was a dead bison. A huge one, just ripped apart. I've seen wolf kills before, but this was different. The whole bottom half was gone, parts of the front too. Like a bunch of animals had just feasted on it. But the blood was still fresh. Flies were everywhere, guts were spilling out, and the bull's face of it looked shocked. I almost threw up. I was gagging, sweating, trying to breathe. My collar felt tight, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. What could do something like this? Then, I saw it. A thick trail of blood, starting a few feet from the bison, leading into the trees, like something bleeding had walked away. Or, as I would soon learn, was carried. I followed the trail, and then I saw something move through the trees. Something huge. I couldn't see it clearly, but it was dark brown and black, and way bigger than anything I'd ever seen. And it was moving silently, except for when it pushed through the thick bushes. Every single instinct I had screamed at me to get the hell out of there. And I listened. I bolted. I pedaled like my life depended on it, trees blurring past me. I didn't care if I broke the bike, I'd just run. I finally made it back to the main area, threw the bike down, and burst into the office. Ben was startled, to say the least. Clues, the par yelled, gasping for air. My heart was pounding, and I was desperate for water. The fuck? Why? What happened? Ben jumped up, looking at me like I was crazy. I took a second to catch my breath, coughing because my throat was so dry, but I managed to say, "There's something out there. It killed some bison, and it's way too close to the camping sites." Something. What something? He was confused, but he grabbed his coat and hat, still taking me seriously. I don't know, but it was huge. Bigger than anything, and it completely ripped apart a full-grown bison. That's when I realized how insane I sounded. But Ben knew me. He knew I wouldn't make this up. He looked at me half convinced, half thinking I'd lost it. But he nodded and started talking on his walkie-talkie, telling everyone to get people out and stop anyone from coming in. He said I'd seen a predator, and it had spooked the bison. I was so relieved. I sat down, wiped the sweat off my forehead, and finally got some water from my bag. The rest of the day I paced around, looking out the window, asking Ben for updates. He said they were getting everyone out, at least everyone they could find, and no one had seen anything weird. I tried to relax. I told myself everyone was safe, but I couldn't shake this feeling. Something was very, very wrong. "Hey, I'm going to call it a night," Ben said, heading towards our shared bedroom. I looked at him, feeling a wave of unease. "No, it's not that. Late," I said, not wanting to be alone. Ben scratched his nose and hung up his hat. "Yeah, and you should probably get some sleep as well. You need it more than I do, actually." I stared at him, thinking. He was right, I was exhausted. But I didn't want to leave things unwatched. Whatever that thing was, I had no idea. Maybe I'd mistaken a shadow or a group of bison for something else, but that didn't explain the dead bull. Animal or crazy people, there was something dangerous out there. I sighed and rubbed my eyes, looking out the window again. It was getting dark, the sun almost gone. It was actually kind of beautiful. I started to relax a little. Against my better judgment, I decided to get some air. Not like a walk in the woods or anything. Just a few steps outside the front door. I stood there, breathing deeply. The air was crisp and clean. It always calmed me down. This park. I was about to go back in, but then I stopped. That feeling again. That something was wrong. I didn't want to be out here anymore. I turned to go back inside, and that's when I saw it. Like a ghost, it had snuck up on me. It must have come from the trees behind the cabin. Walked right past, and stopped to look at me. It was standing there, huge, towering over me in the cabin. It was impossible. It couldn't be real. A T-Rex. A full-grown Tyrannosaurus Rex. At least 13 feet tall at the hip, maybe 40 feet long, and probably 10 tons, if not more. It was dark brown, with black on its neck, back, and tail. Even in the fading light, I could see orange and tan on its massive head. The dinosaur looked down at me, its amber eyes curious, almost pitying. Its nostrils flared, and I could see the little feathers on its head and neck stand up, then relax. I was frozen, shocked, terrified, in awe. I felt like an insect in front of a god. My mind couldn't process it. My knees were shaking, my heart was racing, and I was drenched in sweat. I couldn't even speak. Then, suddenly, I snapped out of it. I scrambled back inside and slammed the door shut. I backed away, my eyes darting to the window, and there it was. The T-Rex had walked right up to the window and lowered its head to peer inside. Its eyes locked with mine, and I backed away, pressing myself against the wall. It just stared at me, tilting its head, and I could see the intelligence in its eyes. A spark of awareness, just like a human. Its pupils were like black pools, holding memories of a world so different from mine. It sniffed, then opened its mouth, fogging up the glass with its breath. But even through the fog, I could see its teeth. Huge, serrated, like railroad spikes. My stomach clenched, and I felt like I was going to throw up. I imagined what those teeth could do to me. The Rex could easily smash through the cabin and swallow me whole if it wanted to. And I had no idea if it did or not. It kept staring, then lifted its head and walked away. The room got brighter as the giant predator moved away from the window. I was still glued to the wall, shaking. It made a sound, a deep hum that vibrated through me, like the rumbling from before. And then it hit me. That was the rumbling. That was what killed the bison. The sound escalated into a long, drawn-out bellow, louder than anything I'd ever heard. The sound of a lost world hit me like a physical force, and I collapsed, curling into a ball. As the bellow faded, Ben burst into the room in his pajamas, demanding to know what was going on. I couldn't answer. I remember Ben trying to calm me down, but it took a while for me to even speak. I found myself sitting on my bed, shaking uncontrollably and stuttering out words. When I finally managed to tell him there was a T-Rex outside, he looked at me like I was completely insane. And who could blame him? But, luckily for me, he knew something had really shaken me up, and something had definitely made that noise. Maybe not a T-Rex, but something serious. He left to make some calls. I had no idea who he was calling. Alone in the room, I grabbed my laptop and started typing all this out. My fingers were flying, but my body was still trembling. I kept glancing at the window, then finally closed the curtains. After I post this, I'm calling Chloe. I hope to God she believes me. I have one finger on the dial button, and the other is still typing away on the keyboard as I finish this off. To whoever reads this, be careful. Warn everyone you can. Stay away from the woods. Lock your doors. Don't go out unless you have to, and bring a weapon. The dinosaurs are back. Somehow, someway, they are back. So, there I was, curled up on the bed, shaking like a leaf, trying to explain to Ben that we had a freaking T-Rex problem. He's looking at me like I've completely lost it, which, fair enough. I probably would have reacted the same way if our roles were reversed. He's trying to be all calm and rational, saying things like, "Alex, are you sure you saw what you think you saw?" And maybe it was just a beer or a trick of the light. A beer. A trick of the light. I wanted to scream at him. Instead, I just kept repeating, it was a T-Rex. Ben. A real, live, breathing Tyrannosaurus Rex. I must have said the word dinosaur about 100 times in 5 minutes. Finally, he seems to realize that I'm not just messing around. He still doesn't believe me about the dinosaur, obviously, but he understands that something major happened, and that I saw something, even if he thinks I am mistaken. He goes back into the main room to make some calls. I have no idea who he's calling. The police, the military, the Ghostbusters. I was still too freaked out to even care at that point. I sat there on the bed, trying to get a grip. I felt like I was going to be sick. My head was spinning, and every muscle in my body was tense. I kept seeing that thing's face in my mind, its massive head, those intelligent eyes, and those teeth, oh God, those teeth. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, I grabbed my laptop again. I needed to write it all down, get it out of my head and onto the screen. Maybe if I saw it all written out, it would make more sense. Or maybe I was just hoping anyone, would believe me. I started typing like a madman, trying to describe everything as accurately as I could. The size of the creature, the color, the way it moved, the sounds it made, everything. I even tried to describe the feeling of pure, primal terror that washed over me when I saw it. I finished my frantic writing session and hit post, somewhere online. I don't even remember where. Maybe some obscure forum or a social media site. I didn't care. I just needed to get the story out there. Then I did what I should have done earlier. I called Chloe. The phone rang and rang, each ring feeling like an eternity. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Finally, she picked up. "Hello." Her voice was groggy, like I'd woken her up, which I had. It was the middle of the night after all. "Slow, it's Alex. You need to listen to me, Alex." "What's wrong? What time is it?" "It doesn't matter what time it is. Something insane is happening here. There's a dinosaur in the park." Silence. I could practically hear her brain trying to process what I'd just said. "A dinosaur?" she finally asked, laced with disbelief. "Yes, a T-Rex. I saw it. It's huge, Chloe, and it's dangerous. It killed a bison, ripped it apart." I started rambling, telling her everything I'd seen, everything I'd felt. I probably sounded like a lunatic, but I didn't care. She had to believe me. Chloe was silent for a long time after I finished. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Finally, she spoke, her voice slow and cautious. "Alex, are you sure about this? A T-Rex? That's impossible." "I know it sounds crazy, Chloe, but I swear I'm telling the truth. You have to believe me." Okay. Just calm down," she said, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. "I'm gonna make some calls, see if anyone else has reported anything unusual. Just stay inside, okay? Don't go anywhere." "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We hung up, and I was left alone again, with nothing but my fear and the image of that monstrous creature burned into my brain. I sat there for hours, staring at the closed curtains, jumping at every little sound. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the T-Rex. As the first rays of dawn started to creep through the curtains, I heard a knock on the door. It was Ben. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot. "They're sending someone," he said, his voice hoarse. "Who?" I asked. "Who are they sending?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Some kind of special unit. They wouldn't tell me much, just that they were taking this very seriously." "Well, they should," I muttered. "It's a freaking dinosaur." Ben just sighed and ran a hand through his hair. He still didn't fully believe me, I could tell. But he was taking it seriously enough to get someone involved. And that was something, at least. We waited in silence, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. The only sound was the occasional chirp of a bird outside, a sound that was usually so peaceful, but now just made me more anxious. Every chirp sounded like it could be followed by a roar. Every rustle of leaves could be the T-Rex approaching. Finally, after what felt like another lifetime, we heard the sound of vehicles approaching. Several of them, by the sound of it. Ben and I went outside, squinting in the morning light. A group of SUVs and trucks pulled up, kicking up dust as they came to a stop. Men and women in dark uniforms got out, their faces grim, their movements efficient. They looked like soldiers, or some kind of specialized government agency. One of them, a tall woman with a stern expression and short, dark hair, approached us. "I'm Agent Reynolds," she said, her voice all business. "We're here about the situation, Doc." "The dinosaur," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Agent Reynolds looked at me, her expression unreadable. "Right," she said. "The dinosaur. Can you tell us everything you saw?" And so, for the third time that night, I told my story. I told them about the rumbling, the stampede, the dead bison, and the terrifying creature I'd seen outside the cabin. This time, though, they listened without interrupting. They listened with focused intensity, their eyes never leaving mine. When I was finished, Agent Reynolds nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. "We're going to investigate. In the meantime, I need you both to stay here. Don't go anywhere, and don't talk to anyone about this. This is a matter of national security now." National security. Hearing those words made it all feel even more real, even more terrifying. They set up a perimeter around the cabin, these agents, with their guns and their serious faces. They looked like they were preparing for war. And maybe they were. A war against a creature that shouldn't even exist. Ben and I were left alone again, watching them from the window, two ordinary park rangers caught up in something extraordinary, something unbelievable. We were trapped in a nightmare, and all we could do was wait and see what would happen next. The fear was still there, gnawing at me, but now there was something else mixed in with it. A strange sense of anticipation. The world had changed. The impossible had become real, and we were right in the middle of it. So, there we were, Ben and I, stuck inside the cabin like a couple of caged animals. Outside, Agent Reynolds and her crew were busy setting up their operation. They had all sorts of gear, computers, satellite phones, some kind of weird radar things, and of course, enough firepower to take down a small army. Or, a dinosaur. We spent the next few hours pacing around, peering out the windows, trying to figure out what they were doing. Every now and then, we'd catch a glimpse of Agent Reynolds talking into her radio, her face grim, her voice low. It was all very hush, hush, very top secret. It felt like we were in a movie, except it was real, and the monster was very, very real. The waiting was the worst part. The not knowing. Every minute that ticked by felt like an hour. My stomach was in knots, and I couldn't stop replaying the image of that T-Rex in my head. Those eyes. Those teeth. Ben was trying to stay calm, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He kept looking at me, a silent question in his gaze. He still wasn't sure he believed me, not entirely, but he was starting to come around. How could he not, with all this military-grade activity happening right outside our door? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Agent Reynolds came back to the cabin. She had two other agents with her, both of them looking like they could bench press a car. "We're going to need your help," she said to us, her voice direct and to the point. "You know this area better than anyone. What do you need us to do?" Ben asked, stepping forward. "We need you to show us where you saw the creature," she said, still seeming hesitant to use the word dinosaur. "And where you found the bison carcass." My heart leaped into my throat. Go back out there, near that thing. No way. But what choice did we have? "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We'll help." They gave us some gear, heavy, duty vests, radios, and, to my surprise, tranquilizer guns. "These are loaded with high-dose tranquilizers," Agent Reynolds explained. "These should be enough to slow it down at least." But be careful. These are only a deterrent. Our primary objective is to observe and track, not engage, unless absolutely necessary. Is that understood? We both nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. This was it. We were going hunting for a dinosaur. We got into one of their SUVs, a big, rugged thing that looked like it could handle anything. One of the agents was driving, and the other one was riding shotgun, his hand never far from his weapon. Ben and I sat in the back, the silence broken only by the crackle of the radio. As we drove deeper into the woods, the feeling of dread intensified. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept scanning the trees, half expecting to see that monstrous form charging at us. We reached the spot where I'd seen the bison stampede. The clearing was empty now, but the memory of that thundering herd was still fresh in my mind. I pointed towards the direction they'd come from, and we continued on. The tension in the vehicle was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone was on edge, their senses on high alert. We were hunting a predator unlike any other, a creature from a time long past, and we were doing it in its territory. Finally, we reached the place where I'd found the dead bison. The carcass was still there, or what was left of it. The sight of it made me gag, the memory of that horrific scene flooding back. It was right around here, I said, my voice trembling. I saw it moving through the trees, over there. I pointed towards the thick foliage where I had seen the dark shape moving. Agent Reynolds nodded and signaled to her team. They fanned out, their weapons raised, their movements cautious and precise. They were like a well-oiled machine, each person knowing their role, their movements synchronized. We followed them, Ben and I sticking close together, our tranquilizer guns feeling heavy and useless in our hands. We moved slowly, carefully, through the dense undergrowth. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of our boots on the forest floor. Then, we heard it. A low rumble, deep and resonant, vibrating through the ground and up into our bones. The rumbling. It was the same sound I'd heard before, the sound that had haunted my dreams for the past few days. Everyone froze, their eyes wide, their bodies tense. What was that? One of the agents whispered, his voice barely audible. It's it, I said, my voice trembling. It's the T-Rex. The rumbling grew louder, closer. We could feel the ground shaking now, a subtle tremor that sent shivers down our spines. Then through the trees we saw it, a massive shape, moving slowly, deliberately. Dark brown and black scales, glinting in the dappled sunlight. A huge head, with powerful jaws and teeth like daggers. The T-Rex. It was even bigger than I remembered, even more terrifying. It moved with a strange grace for something so massive, its powerful legs carrying its immense weight with ease. It stopped, its head raised, its nostrils flaring. It was sniffing the air, testing the wind. It knew we were here. Agent Reynolds raised her hand, signaling everyone to hold their fire. We stood there frozen, watching the creature, our hearts pounding in our chests. The T-Rex let out a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was a sound of pure, primal power, a sound that sent a jolt of pure terror through me. Then, it started to move again, slowly, deliberately heading straight towards us. This was it. The hunt was over. The hunted had become the hunter. And we were the prey. The T-Rex was coming. Slowly, deliberately, like it had all the time in the world. And maybe it did. It was the apex predator, after all, king of its domain, even if that domain was millions of years out of its time. We were frozen, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and awe. The agents, seasoned professionals though they were, seemed just as stunned as Ben and I. This was no ordinary threat. This was a creature out of a nightmare, a monster from a time when humans weren't even a blip on the evolutionary radar. Agent Reynolds was the first to recover. "Hold your fire," she hissed, her voice low and urgent. "Remember the objective. Observe and track. Only engage if necessary." Easy for her to say. She wasn't the one staring down a living, breathing, roaring dinosaur. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the tranquilizer gun. I had a feeling it wouldn't do much good anyway. It was like trying to stop a tank with a pea shooter. The T-Rex kept coming, its massive feet shaking the ground with each step. Its eyes, those intelligent, amber eyes, were locked on us. It was studying us, assessing us, deciding whether we were worth the effort of a chase. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there and wait for this prehistoric monster to decide our fate. Then, it stopped, about 50 feet away, close enough that we could see the individual scales on its massive legs, the scars on its snout, and the terrifying glint of its teeth. It lowered its head, sniffing the air, its nostrils flaring. We could hear the low rumble in its chest, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in our bones. It was close enough to smell a musky, reptilian odor that made my stomach churn. For a moment, an eternity, we were locked in a silent standoff. Humans and dinosaur, predator and prey, separated by a few feet and millions of years of evolution. Then, without warning, it moved, not towards us, but to the side. It began to circle us, slowly, deliberately, like a shark circling a piece of driftwood. It was testing us, probing our defenses, looking for a weakness. The agents shifted their positions, their weapons tracking the creature's movements. They were tense, ready to react, but they held their fire, following Agent Reynolds' orders. The T-Rex continued to circle, its eyes never leaving us. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and calculating. It was like being under a microscope, dissected and analyzed by a creature far older and far more powerful than anything I could comprehend. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. It stood there, facing us, its massive head cocked slightly to one side. It seemed to be listening. We listened too, straining to hear anything over the pounding of our hearts. At first there was nothing. Just the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the usual sounds of the forest. Then we heard it. A faint, distant rumble, similar to the one the T-Rex had been making, but higher pitched, more frantic. The T-Rex's head shot up, its eyes widening. It let out a low growl, a sound of concern, maybe even fear. It turned its head, looking in the direction of the distant rumbling. Then, it did something that none of us expected. It turned and ran. Not towards us, but away. Away from us, and towards the source of the distant rumbling. We watched, stunned, as the massive creature disappeared into the trees, its movements surprisingly swift and silent for something so large. The forest fell silent again, the only sound the frantic beating of our hearts. What just happened? Ben whispered, his voice hoarse. Agent Reynolds lowered her weapon, her face a mixture of confusion and relief. I don't know, she said. But I think we just got lucky. We stayed there for a long time, listening, watching, waiting to see if the T-Rex would return. But it didn't. Finally, Agent Reynolds gave the order to move out. We returned to the vehicles, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving us exhausted and drained. As we drove back to the cabin, I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Why had the T-Rex run? What was that distant rumbling? Then, it hit me. The rumbling, the higher pitch, it sounded like another T-Rex. Maybe even a younger one. Could it be? Could there be more than one? A family, perhaps. The thought sent a chill down my spine. One T-Rex was terrifying enough. The idea of a whole family of them was almost too much to bear. Back at the cabin, Agent Reynolds contacted her superiors, reporting what had happened. They listened, asked questions, and then gave their orders. We were to be debriefed, sworn to secrecy, and then sent home. They would handle the situation. As for the T-Rex or Rexes, they were now the government's problem. What they planned to do about them, I had no idea. Capture them, study them, or something else entirely. I didn't know, and honestly I didn't want to know. A few days later, Ben and I were back home, trying to return to our normal lives. But nothing felt normal anymore. The world had changed. We had seen the impossible, faced a creature from a lost world, and survived. We were sworn to secrecy, of course. We couldn't tell anyone what we had seen. Not our friends, not our families, not even Chloe. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I hear it. A faint, distant rumble carried on the breeze. And I remember the terror, the awe, the sheer impossibility of it all. I remember the T-Rex, and I wonder if it's still out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness of Yellowstone, roaming free, a relic of a time long past, a reminder that the world is still full of mysteries, and that some things are beyond our understanding. And sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if maybe, just maybe, that's not such a bad thing after all. The world needs its mysteries. It needs its monsters. They remind us that we're not always in control, that there are forces at work beyond our comprehension. And who knows, maybe one day we'll learn to live alongside them. Or maybe they'll just fade back into the mists of time, leaving us with nothing but legends and whispers of the days when dinosaurs roamed the earth. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that roar, and I'll never look at the woods the same way again. Not ever. I got this email, right, saying I was shortlisted for the fire lookout gig. I figured it was just a polite thanks, but no thanks. I mean, who quits that kind of dream job mid-season? Turns out someone did. And if I could get my butt up there by tomorrow, the job was all mine. I got the call on my way to work at this total dive bar where I was slinging drinks. I finished the drive, waltzed right in, and told my boss I was out of there. I'd found something way better. I could almost hear the collective groan of the regulars. But honestly, I didn't care. Freedom. I grabbed whatever non-perishable food I could find in my apartment and hit the road. Drove through the whole night. Luckily, this was a drive-up tower, so I didn't have to worry about hiking and half asleep. Perks, right? I think I hid my zombie state pretty well when Ranger Rick, that was the guy showing me the ropes, gave me the tour. First stop, my new digs. A tiny cabin, but cozy. And get this, it had running water. I wasn't sure what to expect out in the boonies, so finding a shower was like hitting the jackpot. I had to stifle a few yawns as we headed out into the warm sunshine to check out the area. There was this little meadow before you hit the forest, but just a few steps into the trees, I saw something that woke me up real fast. There'd been a fire there, and not that long ago. Everything was gray and brown, and the few trees still standing looked like they were about to keel over any second. Without the canopy, the whole area just looked naked. Compared to the lush green forest surrounding it, this place was like a giant, ugly scar. "Whoa," I said, stating the obvious. "Is this why the last lookout bounced? It's crazy how close this must have been to the tower." "Nah, Samuel hung around after the fire. We got him out just hours before it hit here," Rick explained. "Samuel got spooked by the animals. We think there might have been a grizzly that got caught in the fire. We're not sure if it's still around or not, so I wanted to talk to you about safety and all that before I go." My mind immediately conjured up this image of some horrific, half-burnt bear wandering around in the woods, and for the first time it hit me, I was going to be out here completely alone. But I shoved that thought down. This was what I wanted, what I signed up for. "So, that's why Samuel left?" I asked. "Yeah, he just had some kind of run-in late at night, and it freaked him out. Not everyone can handle being out here alone." I wanted to grill him for more details, but I figured we'd get to that during the safety briefing. And, well, I was determined to prove that I could handle it. I didn't want Rick thinking I'd just bolt over some spooked-up bear. When we climbed the long steps to the top of the tower, any doubts I had vanished. The view was insane. Even the burnt patch of forest couldn't ruin it. If anything, it made the untouched parts look even more vibrant, more alive, in contrast to that desolate scar. I could handle anything out here if this was my reward. The mountains looked like they stretched on forever. The rest of the orientation was pretty smooth sailing. I'd volunteered a few times before, so Rick seemed to think I could hold my own. Things got a little weird near the end, though, during the safety talk back in the cab. We covered bear safety, you know, the usual stuff, and it was mostly things I already knew. But Rick seemed really hesitant when I tried to get him to spill the beans about what exactly made the last guy run for the hills. I wanted to know if the bear had charged him or messed with the cabin. Rick kind of danced around the question before finally saying, "Look, sometimes after a fire, the animals, bears, deer, hell, even the squirrels, they just act off. It can be unsettling. You're out here all alone, and the wildlife, some of which is big enough to hurt you, is acting all screwy. It can be too much. I could tell you some stories about the things guys in this job say they've seen after a fire, and you wouldn't believe what they come up with." "Like what?" I pressed. I was hooked. "I don't want to fill your head with ghost stories and nonsense when you're about to start your first big job, kid." "I don't mind," I insist. "Really, it's nothing, and I should be going anyway," Rick said, gathering his papers. "Just watch yourself, okay? And, well, keep an eye on the animals, too. They might be a bit out of sorts right now. That fire was just last week." "What should I watch for?" I asked, refusing to let it go. "Just anything strange. You'll be all right, kid." And with that, Rick left, leaving me all alone with my thoughts. I had that first day to get settled in, but I hadn't exactly brought a lot with me. I figured I'd just go back home my first weekend and grab what I really need. But hey, I had my sketchbook, and Samuel had left behind a bunch of reading material. I figured he wouldn't mind if I borrowed his books until he came back for them. He was supposed to come up at some point to get his stuff. He'd also left a sleeping bag all crumpled up in the tower, which gave me a bit of the creep. It definitely hinted that he'd gotten out of there in a hurry. After I got the lay of the land, I decided to take a quick nap in the cabin. Quick turned into the rest of the day, and I didn't wake up until the sun was setting. I scrambled up to the top of the tower, relieved I hadn't missed my first sunset. There were only a few clouds, but this fog was rolling in from the west, making the hollows of the hills look all hazy and bright. I watched the sky turn from orange to pink, feeling more at peace than I had since I got there. But just as the sun was about to dip completely behind the far ridge, something caught my eye. Way off on a distant peak, the treetops were rustling like something was jumping from branch to branch. I grabbed the binoculars from the top of the bookshelf, only to find both lenses were cracked. And, to make things even weirder, there were these brownish-red stains spiderwebbed along the cracks. I dropped those suckers real quick. I had a pair in my bag, but I hadn't brought anything up yet, so I just squinted, trying to see what was going on. There was this dark, smooth shape, kind of moving along the tops of the trees. It looked big, maybe a marten or a bear cub, but the weird thing was, it wasn't really jumping. It was like it was just flowing. I was pretty far away, and the fog was getting thicker as the sun went down, so I figured maybe I just couldn't see it clearly. The way it moved was so fluid, almost like it was floating, so sure of itself it didn't need to pause. As it got closer to a small clearing, I held my breath, thinking I'd finally get a better look when it had to drop to the ground. But then, the thing just didn't. It didn't drop down. It hadn't been jumping along the treetops. It was just that tall. The thing was as tall as the freaking tree. I watched as it started to come out of the woods, but just as I thought I might be able to make out some details, it turned its head and looked right at me. Its round head, perched on that long neck, jerked suddenly, and even from miles away I knew it was looking at me because I could see its glowing orange eyes locked onto mine. That was it. I scrambled down below the windows, hiding where they couldn't see me. I stayed like that for a long time, way past sunset. When my heart finally stopped hammering and my hands stopped sweating, I managed to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. I made myself walk, not run, but walk calmly, like a sane person, down the steps to my cab. I didn't sleep at all that first night. When dawn finally broke, I started setting up my stuff. I wanted to tidy up the cabin a bit before morning check-in. I put all of Samuel's things in a corner, nice and neat, for when he eventually came back. I spent some time studying the map on the firefinder, that big circular map thing they use to pinpoint fire. I saw a couple of the other lookout towers marked near the edge of my map. There were 5 of us in total in this forest, and it was kind of comforting to know there were other people out here, even if they were miles away. The firefinder itself seemed to be in good shape, but I didn't like that Samuel had scribbled all over the glass covering the map with a grease pencil, a bunch of X's, and he'd frantically circled a few spots near the cabin, which I definitely didn't appreciate. Just as my mind started trying to figure out if any of those X's matched up with what I saw last night, I decided to get rid of them. I wasn't going to let some crazy guy's scribbles mess with my head. I erased every last one of them and tried not to think about where they'd been. The morning meeting was nothing special, but it was nice to see some friendly faces, even if it was just on a video call. Everyone welcomed me to the team. They all seemed nice, but most of their names went in one ear and out the other. I was running on fumes. That first day passed without anything crazy happening, and as the week went on, I started to settle into a routine. I was even starting to chill out a little after that first freaky night. We had Wi-Fi at the tower, but I was trying to pretend I didn't. Except for the meetings, of course. I wanted to unplug. So I started working my way through Samuel's books until I could get some of my own from home. He had mostly horror paperbacks, which, okay, maybe not the best choice for someone alone in the woods, but whatever. There were some nature books too, like any good fire lookout should have. My favorite was this field guide about all the trees in the area. Mostly pine, but I didn't realize how many different kinds there were in this forest. I started taking that field guide with me everywhere, and trying to identify and sketch the different trees when I was off duty. It was especially interesting to walk through the burnt area and see what was already fighting for space in the ashes of the old forest. A lot of the trees around here had thick bark and tall branches, dropping the lower ones as they grew, like they were trying to be fireproof. Other trees had fire built into their whole life cycle. New shoots near the base of old trees would get a jump start after a blaze. But my personal favorite adaptation was these things called serotinous cones. Basically, the pine cones would stay shut tight for years, even decades, refusing to drop any seeds until they got toasted in a fire, and the waxy seal keeping them closed finally broke. I didn't spot any fires that first week, and after 10 days, it was time for my weekend. It was 10 days on, 4 days off, so I had plenty of time to head home and actually pack the way I meant to. On the drive back, I was stoked to be leaving civilization behind for good. My excitement took a nosedive, though, when I saw someone waiting for me at the cabin. At first, I thought maybe he was a hiker, so I put on my best customer service voice. "Hey man, how's it going?" I asked. "You're my replacement. he said. It wasn't a question. Then it clicked, the backpack he was wearing. It had to be Samuel, back for his stuff. I guess I am. Nice to meet you. I held out my hand, but he didn't take. I'm just gonna say what I'm gonna say, okay? Okay, I replied, a little confused. They're lying to you. Rick and the other lookouts. There's something weird going on here. I just wanted to warn you because it's the right thing to do. I know you're not going to believe me, and that's okay. Samuel, I said, what did you see that made you leave? I saw a bear watching me sleep, he said, just like that. Then he pointed up at the tower. He was watching me sleep from up there. What do you mean, from the tower? I let out a nervous laugh. Samuel, that's not possible. I said what I'm gonna say, and I'm leaving. He pushed past me, heading towards his car. I called after him, but he just got in and drove off. That night I slept up in the tower, not because I was scared of what might be out there, but because I wanted to look at the star. What Samuel said was so out there, so ridiculous, that it honestly made me feel a little better about the whole situation. Over the next week I saw my first storm from the tower. It was awesome and terrifying all at the same time. I also spotted my first fire. When I radioed it in, though, Sarah, the girl to the east of me, had already seen it. I used the firefinder to help pinpoint it, and it felt good to actually be doing, fire lookout stuff. As summer went on, I explored more and more of the forest around the tower. I'd brought some watercolors with me after that first weekend. I spent a lot of time painting, drawing, and reading. But more than that, I spent time just sitting in the tower, staring out at the mountains, even when I was off the clock. It was so easy to just get lost in watching the forest move. I felt more at peace than I ever had in my life. I'd never really felt comfortable back home. Growing up in the city, you'd think I'd be used to crowds, but everything was so loud, and I could never force myself to be a people person. I always felt like there was something just a bit off about me, something that put people on edge. I could never quite get that easygoing vibe that everyone else seemed to have. I had friends, sure, and relationships, but it always felt like something was different about how I interacted with people compared to how they were with each other. I'd catch girlfriends watching me sometimes, like they were trying to figure me out, like I was some kind of puzzle. And friends, even ones I'd known for years, were never close to me in the same way they were with each other. But out here, none of that mattered. It was just me and the forest. Sometimes the other watchers would call wanting to chat, and more often than not, I found myself ignoring them. I mean, wasn't the whole point of coming out here to get some peace and quiet? I started spending my weekends going on these epic, all-day hikes, venturing farther and farther into the forest. One day, I decided to follow the burnt area as far as I could. By then, there were tons of saplings coming up, enough to blanket most of the forest floor in this soft green. Aside from it being extra sunny, the hike wasn't that different from my others, until early afternoon when I found something really strange. I noticed it because it was propped up on one side by a sapling that was struggling under a patch of fur. It was a bear carcass, or at least part of one. The hide was definitely there, so at first, I thought maybe someone had skinned it, but they'd made a real mess of it. The fur wasn't cut in any pattern, but it didn't look like it had just decomposed either. There was still blood in some place. I figured maybe someone had killed it for food, and that's why they didn't care about the hide. But that didn't make much sense. It'd be way less risky to hunt pretty much any other animal. I started digging around in the loose fur, thinking maybe I could find the skull. It would be cool to show Ranger Rick. Right away, I noticed there weren't any bones or flesh. So I started thinking again that maybe it was just a botched skinning job. But then I saw a flash of white in the ash, and that's when it hit me. There was a ton of ash on the remains, like it had been here before the fire, or maybe it was killed by the fire. But that didn't add. The fur would have been burnt to a crisp. I dug through the ash and found a tooth, then more teeth. Then I found something squishy and realized it was an eyeball. Another quick dig, and I found the other one. After that, I had no idea what to make of it. I looked at the skin some more, and it looked less and less like a knife had made those cuts. It was like the bear had just exploded, jagged shreds all around the edges of the piece. I headed back to the tower after that, convinced that something seriously weird was going on, and I was going to get to the bottom of it. I felt like an explorer on the verge of some huge discovery. That night, I slept in the tower again while a storm raged outside. It was exhilarating. I woke up just as the sun was starting to peek over the horizon, and I grabbed my binoculars. It was another foggy morning, and off in the distance I saw it again, that dark, shadowy figure moving through the forest. It was closer this time, but it looked shorter than the first one I'd seen, even though it was closer. This one was on all fours, and its stocky build had me wondering if it was even the same kind of creature. Maybe there were a bunch of these things out here. It reared up on its hind legs and looked right at me from 3 peaks to the west, its eyes burning like the rising sun. Then it dropped back down and started heading in my direction. Good, I thought. Let it come. I lost sight of it when the morning fog cleared. I went about my day as usual after that. I spotted a small fire, but it turned out to just be some campers who hadn't gotten the memo about where they were allowed to build fires. That night at sunset, I perched in my tower, watching for anything that might be watching me back. It wasn't long before I spotted the beast again, way closer this time. It wasn't as tall as the first creature. This was definitely a different one, and it had a humped back. Its eyes were the same flickering orange, but as it got closer, I still couldn't make out much else. It was like a moving shadow, but as it moved, the trees moved with it. By the time it reached the tower, it was dark, but it was close enough that I could start to piece things together. It reared up again, peering into the tower, blocking out an entire side. It had a round head, like the first one, but with a long, drawn-out mouth, almost like a snout. It blended into the night, so it was hard to see much, but when it opened its mouth, I saw only more blackness. The creature didn't have fur or skin or anything solid. It didn't even look quite real, and it was impossible to make out any features. But one thing I could see for sure as it sniffed and panted at my window was that it didn't have any teeth. I wondered if it was looking for the ones I'd brought back with me, the ones I'd added to my collection. After that, I knew what I had to do. It was another week before we got another fire. After I called it in and got the coordinates, I bolted for my car. Something amazing was happening, and I needed to see it for myself. I parked on a hill close enough to see, but not close enough to be seen, and hopefully not close enough to get toasted. I hiked as close as I dared and watched from a distance as helicopters battled the blaze. This was a small one, and it was pretty clear they weren't going to have any trouble with it, so I started to move in closer. I'd come prepared with a respirator, but the smoky smell in the air was still thick. I waited until the choppers cleared out, then I moved in to check out the ashes. The whole burned area was contained along just a small part of the mountainside. They'd gotten to it fast, and the recent rain probably helped slow it down. By the time I found what I was looking for in the still smoldering embers, it was almost sunset, and my head was pounding from the smoke, but it was worth it. Lying among the smoking ash and embers was a snakeskin, but it wasn't shed and it wasn't burned. It was ripped to shreds. I dug around in the still warm ash at one end and found tiny white teeth. Carefully, I started sifting through the ash with my fingers, looking for something soft. This took longer, but I finally found my prize about a foot away, like it had been thrown. Buried in ash, but completely intact, was a single tiny eye. That night, I slept like a baby up in my tower, and when I woke up, I was greeted by a new friend in the distance. At the very edge of my vision, along the farthest peak to the south, was another shadow. Only this one stood on 2 feet, and as it walked, its long arms swayed at its sides. I stopped drawing in my sketchbook and started writing down all my theories. Whatever was going on, I wanted to be the one to document every minute of it. When the other watchers called, my excuses for why I couldn't chat got less and less polite, and soon I just stopped picking up altogether if it wasn't during work hours. I didn't have time for them. I had way more important things to do. This led to Ranger Rick paying me a visit on my day off, no less. The nerve of some people. He said he just wanted to check on me, that he was worried because I hadn't been socializing much. I told him I was just really enjoying my alone time, but that I'd try to be more sociable. He tried to weasel his way into my tower, using the excuse of a morning cup of coffee, but I politely turned him down, saying I had a lot to get done that day. I couldn't let him see my collection, not yet. Things were going great until I got my first hiker. Then they were going even better. His name was Alex, and he'd wandered over from his friends who were apparently camping nearby. The old tower by the visitor center dealt with most of the tourists for our park, but we were still supposed to be friendly if any wandered by. Alex was really friendly, too friendly. He and his friends were definitely either drinking or smoking something, and I couldn't help but judge them for letting him wander off alone. Alex was way too gone to be any trouble, so I figured there was no harm in showing him around. Of course, he wanted to see the top of the tower, so I followed him up, ready to catch him if he stumbled. He spent a good 15 minutes just staring out the windows, not saying a word, which I had to admit I respected. High or not, this guy appreciated nature. I gave him the speech I'd prepared for tourists, the one I hadn't gotten to use yet. How there used to be thousands of these towers almost a century ago. How fire watchers used to try to stop every single fire until they realized that was actually hurting the environment. How regular burns were needed to clear out the dry brush and prevent the really big, catastrophic fires. It was all part of the natural cycle, and we weren't meant to stop it entirely. All the usual stuff. But then I started telling Alex about some of my own theories. I think, actually, that we should take it a step further, I told him. Right on, he said. He'd been throwing me these hippie affirmations the whole time, which, if I'm being honest, was starting to get on my nerves. I think that if we let the fires burn even more, we could learn something about ourselves, about our place in nature. I started pointing to some of my research, which I'd taped to the walls below the windows. See, I have this theory that there are some animals, and maybe even people too, who need the fire to complete their life cycle. Just like those pine trees, they don't become what they're really meant to be unless they burn. I can't figure out why it's all different animals though, and why it's only but I've been wondering if maybe the ones who need it weren't really what they were pretending to be in the first place. I pointed to the drawings I'd done of the human-like creature on the ridge. Or maybe they're chosen to become something different because they're special. That's the theory I like best. But Alex didn't like that. He didn't like my ideas at all. Hey, that's, cool, man. But I should probably get back to my friends. I could see his eyes focusing, like he was sobering up, realizing something was off. His eyes darted nervously over my collection, like he was worried the eyes on the bookshelf were looking back at him. I took him down the steps and walked him back to where he'd stumbled out of the wood. He noticed, for the first time, the spot where I'd been having my bonfires. Isn't there, like, a burn ban right now? He asked, his unease replaced by a flicker of curiosity. Now that we were out of the tower, there is. But don't worry, I told him with a smile. I'm only burning things to make them better. Alex didn't know what to say to that. He just threw me a peace sign and wandered back into the woods. Soon, I could hear voices in the distance. His friends must have been close by. Really close by. The next day, I woke up to several pairs of burning eyes watching me from outside my tower, and several new pairs inside of it. The creatures outside couldn't speak, but I knew what they want. It was time for me to join them. I started at my beloved bonfire pit, then went all around the cabin, splashing gasoline everywhere. Then I liberally doused the dry brush at the edge of the wood. Finally, I trailed a generous amount up the stairs with me, to make sure I couldn't change my mind. Lastly, I soaked my research, all those papers taped to the wall. I realized then that the outside world wasn't ready for what I'd discovered, but that didn't matter. As I lit the match, my friends outside began to fade with the morning sun, but that was okay. I'd be with them soon enough. I dropped the match to the floor and closed my eyes for the last time. I was ready to find my new skin, my new eyes, and become what I was truly meant to be. Hey there, folks. Buckle up, 'cause this ain't your grandma's nature walk. Name's Rick, and I'm your guide to the national park that's practically invisible. Technically, it's called Whispering Pines National Park, but we just call it the Pines. And yeah, it exists, big time. You could have strolled right through it if you've ever been on the west side of Canada. You probably even met me, but guess what? The second you left, poof, mind wiped. I'm no brainiac, so I couldn't tell you why, but that's just what this place does. Now, outside the park, only the suits in the government know about it. But it's got this weird pull, you know. Thousands of tourists show up every year, like moths to a freaky, memory-zapping flame. To keep these folks from becoming permanent residents, a few of us live here year-round. Me. I've been stuck here for 10 years, give or take. We just got the internet like a month ago. It's been a real game changer, finally. We've been begging for it for ages, but our boss, Brenda, is a real stickler for the rules. Only gives us the bare minimum. Once a month, she marches to the edge of the park, chats with someone on the outside using a walkie-talkie, and a week later, boom, the feds show up with a truckload of goodies. We've tried slipping them our wish lists, but since these delivery guys forget about us the moment they leave, it's like talking to a brick wall. Then this flower child-looking guy showed up in a van with a satellite dish that looked like it was from outer space. He went into the forest and never came back. I figure he won't mind if I borrow his internet for a bit, right? Anyway, I've seen a bunch of folks sharing their spooky stories online, so I thought I'd throw in a few of my own. So, what's the deal with Whispering Pines? This place is 50 to 65 acres of mind-bending weirdness. But the real magic, or whatever you want to call it, happens in the center. In a 5-mile circle we call the Heartwood. The deeper you go, the taller the trees get, the thicker the air gets, and the darker it gets. It's like descending into a giant, green well. We keep the edges trimmed so we don't wander in by accident. When one of us goes into the Heartwood, we call it a dive. And I do it pretty much every day, Here's the kicker: distance is all messed up in there. You can walk for hours and end up right back where you started. Or you can take a few steps and suddenly be miles away. We don't use miles or kilometers to measure distance. We use light, or the lack of it. We're talking about illuminance, measured in lux. We even use ocean zones to describe how deep we are: sunlight, twilight, midnight, abyssal, twilight, and at all. The deeper you go, the crazier the wildlife gets. Think Yellowstone, but with a serious twist. The only safe spots are the streams that run through the zones. For some reason, distance is normal around them, and the whole place feels a little less unhinged. Alright, enough chit-chat. Story time. Normally, I stick to the East Stream for tours. It's easy, safe, the usual tourist stuff. But sometimes you get a group that looks like they can handle more. Like this one time, about a year and a half ago, a whole caravan of hikers rolled up, decked out in gear that probably cost more than my yearly salary. I felt like a hobo in my ranger uniform and hat. These guys were pumped, full of questions, practically vibrating with excitement. I started showing them the East Stream Trail, all smiles and showmanship. But I guess I let it on a bit thick, because they looked well bored. And Rick doesn't do bored. So, I said, "All right, folks, I don't usually do this, but you seem like the adventurous type. How about we hit the North Stream instead?" That got me going. Now, there's a reason I avoid the North Stream. First, it's a longer walk from the visitor center, and your boy likes to take it easy. Second, it's a narrow, rocky stream with some seriously steep parts. It's a recipe for twisted ankles, or worse. Plus, you gotta take detours away from the stream and into the woods, and let me tell you, even a few feet into those trees is a gamble. The hike started great. These guys were awesome, telling me about their trip through the Rockies. They'd started in Vancouver and were hitting every major hiking spot on their way to Alaska. One of them, a skinny kid they'd picked up along the way, was tagging along. He was super quiet, barely said a word, always hanging back. Since I wasn't used to the North Stream, I lost track of time, lost track of the light. We were having too much fun. We reached a waterfall where we'd have to detour around a tree as wide as a bus. And that's when the kid finally spoke up. Can we maybe turn back?" he asked, all jittery and pale. I pulled out my lux meter, told everyone to kill their lights for a sec. It read 0.62 lux. We were smack dab in the twilight zone, a good mile deeper than I usually go. "Sorry everyone," I said. "Time to head back. You all got a bonus tour today, whether you liked it or not." They grumbled a little, but they followed me. The kid was practically glued to my back now, making these little whimpering noises. The pines messes with people's heads, and it was clearly getting to him. I've seen people freak out, cry, hallucinate, even try to climb trees to escape, so I knew this kid was about to lose it. We got to another waterfall, another detour, and I stopped to try to calm him down. But then, crack, a sound like a tree snapping in half echoed from the woods behind us. The kid shoved me, hard, and I went sprawling into the creek. Before I could even cuss, he was gone, running straight into the trees. A couple of folks went after him, but I yelled at them to stop. Once everyone was back, we stood there listening. Nothing but silence. "All right," I whispered. "Everyone, stick together. Stay quiet, and don't leave my side." One of the women pointed into the woods. "What about him?" she asked. My job is to get you all out safe," I said. "He's probably just ahead." We walked around the falls back to the stream, every footstep crunching like thunder in the silence. "H-E!" someone shouted, and I whipped around. Everyone was staring into the woods. There was the kid, standing right at the edge of our flashlight beams. The guy who'd yelled was waving his arms. "We're over here." "Stop it, Nabo," I said, trying to keep my voice down. "He heard you. He can follow if he wants." I said, "Stay quiet." He got the message, thankfully. As we walked, the kid seemed to be following us, getting closer. Then one of the women gasped. I've seen some messed up stuff in my time, but what I saw next made my blood turn to ice. The kid was closer, but he wasn't walking. His feet were dragging on the ground. He was being carried. People started crying and I picked up the pace. A low thrumming filled the air, like a heartbeat, growing louder. I turned again, and the kid was less than 20 yards away. His face was blank, empty. But his neck, it was stretched out, grotesquely distended. A black spear, thick as my arm, was sticking out of it. I couldn't see what was holding him, only the blood bubbling around the spear. Then he was gone, lifted into the darkness above. The rest of the hike was a blur of tears and panicked breathing. When we finally got back to the visitor center, they didn't even wait for me to say goodbye. They piled into their cars and peeled out of there. I'm pretty sure they forgot everything the second they crossed the park boundary. They probably think the kid just chickened out and left. I wish I could forget. The kid's car is still here. We got a lot of abandoned cars in our lot. Makes the place look busier than it is. I asked one of the government guys why they don't tell them, and he said something about waiting until it looks less suspicious. Whatever that means. Anyway, I gotta get back to work. Another car just pulled in, and Brenda will have my hide if she catches me goofing off near this van. I got tons more stories, though. Maybe I'll share them later, if the feds don't take this thing away. Catch you on the flip side, folks.